He walked into his penthouse and heard a woman singing in his kitchen. Not a radio, not a television left on by accident. A real, living, breathing human voice drifting through the dark hallway like it belonged there. Landon Pierce, 32 years old, worth more money than most people could count, stood completely still in the doorway, keys in hand, heart stuttering, mind absolutely blank, because this apartment was supposed to be empty, had been empty for 6 months. So who was making tea in his kitchen? If you're watching this story, hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. And don't go anywhere, because this is only the beginning. The night Landon Pierce finally returned to his mother's penthouse, it was raining, the kind of rain that doesn't bother being dramatic about it. No thunder, no lightning, just cold, steady, relentless water coming down over Midtown Manhattan, like the sky had made a quiet decision and wasn't interested in changing its mind. He told his driver to leave, told his assistant not to call, told his daughter's nanny that he'd be back before midnight and not to worry, which was the kind of thing adults said when they were absolutely planning to spend several hours being quietly devastated somewhere no one could see them. The penthouse was on the 41st floor. His mother had loved that. 41, she used to say, is a number that doesn't give up. It keeps going when 40 thought it was done. She said things like that, small, strange observations that made no logical sense and somehow stuck with you for years. She'd been gone for 8 months. He'd owned this building for 7. He hadn't come back since the day he signed the papers. The elevator ride up was the longest 30 seconds of his life. He watched the numbers climb on the panel above the doors, 28, 29, 30, and tried to remember the last time he'd done something just because his mother asked him to. Not because it was a good business decision, not because it benefited the company, just because she'd looked at him with those tired, knowing eyes and said, "Landon, please, just do this one thing for me." She'd wanted him to keep the penthouse, not sell it, not develop it, not convert it into luxury rentals the way his portfolio manager had suggested. Just keep it. Live in it sometimes, she'd said. Let it be a home, not an asset. He'd promised her he would, and then he'd spent 7 months finding every possible reason to stay away. The elevator opened on 41. The hallway was dark. That was normal. The motion sensors should have clicked on when he stepped out. They did. Dim, warm light flooding the marble floor in a slow amber wave. Also normal. He'd had the place maintained, cleaned twice a month. All the utilities kept running. His property manager sent reports. Everything was always fine. He walked to the front door, slid his key into the lock, and pushed it open. The apartment was dark. And then, from somewhere beyond the living room, past the dining area, through the open archway that led to the kitchen, he heard it. Humming. Soft, slightly off-key, completely unselfconscious humming. The kind of sound a person makes when they're absolutely certain they're alone, when they're not performing anything for anyone. A woman's voice, low and warm, wandering through what might have been a half-remembered melody from something old. A song he almost recognized and couldn't name. Landon didn't move. His hand was still on the door handle, cold metal, real. He focused on it, because focusing on the door handle meant he wasn't completely losing his mind in the hallway of his dead mother's apartment at 9:30 on a Tuesday night. He heard the sound of water, a kettle being filled, the soft clink of something ceramic against a countertop. Someone is in my kitchen. The thought arrived slowly, like his brain was deliberately dragging its feet on the way to a conclusion it didn't want to reach. He ran through the possibilities with the same quiet efficiency he applied to problem-solving in boardrooms. His property manager had a key. His housekeeper had a key. His assistant had a key, though she'd been explicitly told never to use it without asking. His daughter knew where the spare was hidden, but his daughter was 9 years old and currently at home 13 blocks away. None of them would be here at 9:30 on a Tuesday. None of them would be humming. He should call the police. That was the rational, obvious, correct response to finding a stranger in your home. Pull out your phone. Dial. Step back into the hallway and wait. Instead, Landon Pierce, who had once sat across from a man attempting to steal $40 million from one of his companies and done nothing but fold his hands on the table and wait him out, walked toward the kitchen. He didn't know why. Later, he'd tell himself it was because he wasn't afraid, which was true, or because he wanted information before he involved anyone else, which was also true. But the real reason, the one he wouldn't admit for a very long time, was that the humming sounded like something he hadn't heard in this apartment since before his mother got sick. It sounded like someone being at home. He stopped in the archway. The kitchen was lit, the overhead light on, warm and ordinary. And standing at the counter with her back to him, wearing a large gray sweater that had seen better years and her dark hair pulled up in a knot that was actively coming apart, was a woman he had never seen in his life. She was pouring hot water into a mug. She had a sandwich on a plate beside her, the kind assembled with the careful economy of someone who knew exactly how much food they had and wasn't wasting any of it. Half a sandwich, one mug of tea, a book open flat on the counter, spine cracked the way books get when they've been read in the same spot too many times. She still hadn't noticed him. "Excuse me," Landon said. The woman spun around so fast she nearly sent the mug off the counter. She caught it, barely, both hands slamming down around the ceramic like a reflex, hot water sloshing over her fingers. She made a sharp sound of pain, sucked in a breath, and then looked up at him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. She had dark eyes, wide right now, with the specific expression of someone running through the exact same mental checklist he'd just run through, except arriving at a very different conclusion. Her face moved through shock, confusion, and then, and this was the part that surprised him, something that looked almost like indignation. "Who are you?" she said. Landon blinked. "Who am I?" "Yes." She straightened, pulling her hands back from the mug and pressing one against her sweater where the water had splashed. She was clearly trying to look more composed than she felt, which he could tell because her voice was completely steady and the rest of her was not. "Who are you, and how did you get in?" "I have a key," he said. "This is my apartment." Something shifted in her face. Not fear exactly. More like the ground moving under her feet and her trying to decide whether to grab for something or just ride it out. "That's not possible," she said slowly. "I have a lease." "A lease?" "A signed legal lease agreement." Her chin came up slightly. "For this apartment, Unit 41A. I've been living here for 3 weeks." Landon looked around the kitchen with fresh eyes. The mug, the book, the sandwich, the dish drying on the rack beside the sink, one plate, one glass, the careful small inventory of someone living alone and making every item count. He looked back at her. "Show me the lease," he said. "Basta." Her name was Emily Brooks, and she did not want to show him the lease. Not because she was hiding anything. She made that clear, her voice carrying a tight, careful dignity that told him she'd had plenty of practice defending herself to people who doubted her. She didn't want to show him because the moment she went to get it, she'd have to turn her back on a strange man who had walked into her apartment at 9:30 at night, and she hadn't fully decided yet whether that was safe. He understood that. He took a step back, putting more space between himself and the archway, and gestured toward the living room. "We can sit," he said, "or I can wait here. I'm not going to—" He stopped, because saying "I'm not going to hurt you" to someone who hadn't accused you of anything was the kind of thing that sounded worse the more sincerely you meant it. "The lease," he said instead. "Please." She looked at him for another long moment. He got the impression she was good at reading people, the way she studied him, quick and thorough, the way teachers learn to read a classroom in the first 30 seconds of a new school year. Whatever she saw appeared to satisfy something, because she nodded once and disappeared down the hallway. Landon stood in the kitchen alone. He looked at her book. It was a worn paperback, the kind sold at used bookstores for $2, the kind someone carries in a bag until the cover goes soft. A post-it note was stuck to the open page, covered in small, dense handwriting. He didn't read it. He looked instead at the window above the sink, at the rain still running down the glass, at the city spread out below in amber and white. His mother had stood at that window. He remembered it suddenly and completely. Her standing exactly where Emily Brooks had been standing, a mug of her own in her hands, looking out over the city and saying something about how beautiful it was to be up high enough to see everything and still feel connected to it. He couldn't remember the exact words. He was losing them, the exact words. That was the thing no one warned you about grief. It wasn't just the person you lost. It was all the specific, irreplaceable details that started going blurry around the edges. Here. Emily had come back. She stood in the kitchen doorway, a step away from him, the same careful distance he'd maintained, and held out a folder. He took it. The lease was 3 pages, professionally formatted, with a letterhead that identified the property management company as Hargrove and Associates Residential. It listed the property address correctly. It listed the unit correctly. It had Emily Brooks' signature on page 3, and beside it, a signature from someone named Martin Cole, identified as the authorized leasing agent for the property owner. Landon had never heard of Martin Cole. He had no property management arrangement with Hargrove and Associates, and there was no authorized leasing agent for this property because this property was not being leased. It had never been listed. He read through the document twice, carefully. Then he closed the folder and handed it back. "How much did you pay?" he asked. She looked at him. "What?" "Up front, security deposit, first month, last month. How much did you pay to sign this lease?" A pause. He watched her jaw tighten slightly. The specific, controlled expression of someone who's learned to keep their financial vulnerability very close to their chest, because showing it has cost them before. $4,200, she said finally. "In cash?" "Bank transfer, to an account they gave me for the management company." She looked at the folder in her hands. "It's all in the paperwork." He already knew what he would find if he traced that account. Nothing good. He pulled out his phone, opened his contacts, and found his property manager's name. "It's 9:30, Emily said. "David won't care." He pressed call and listened to it ring. While it rang, he looked at her again. She was watching him with that same careful, measuring look, still standing in the doorway like she hadn't fully committed to being in the same room as him. "You're a teacher?" He wasn't sure why he said it. The post-it notes, the book. Something about the way she stood. She blinked. "Elementary school, 3rd grade. Why?" "Just the reading." He gestured vaguely at the counter. She looked at the book and then back at him, and the corner of her mouth did something complicated that wasn't quite a smile, but wasn't entirely hostile either. David picked up on the 4th ring, sounding confused and slightly alarmed, which was appropriate. "David," Landon said, "I need everything you have on the 41st floor unit at the Whitmore building. Tonight. I also need you to find out who Martin Cole is and what his connection to the former ownership of this property looks like. And I need the name of whatever contact we have at Manhattan Fraud." He listened. "I know what time it is. Yes, I'll explain later. Tonight, David." He hung up. Emily was still standing in the doorway. The indignation from earlier had softened into something more complicated. Something that looked, if he was reading it right, like someone trying very hard not to be afraid of what they were beginning to understand. "He doesn't exist, does he?" she said. Not really a question. "Martin Cole." Landon didn't answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. "The $4,200, she said. Her voice was careful and flat. "It's gone, most likely." She nodded. Once. Slow. Then she turned, very quietly, picked up her mug of tea, and sat down at the kitchen table. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything. She just sat there with her hands wrapped around the mug and her eyes on the table, and the careful blankness of her expression told him more than anything she could have said. That this wasn't the first time the floor had dropped out from under her. That she'd learned a long time ago that showing how bad it was made it worse. That $4,200 was not an inconvenience to her. It was a catastrophe. It was months. He stayed standing. He didn't know what to do with the silence, which was unusual. He was generally comfortable with silence. In negotiations, silence was a tool. But this wasn't a negotiation. "I'll get it back," he said. She looked up. "The money. I'll have it traced and recovered, or I'll cover it myself and recover it from whoever set this up." He said it the way he said most things, directly, without softening it, because in his experience, people who needed real help didn't need it wrapped in excessive gentleness. They needed it to be true. "You won't be out of pocket for this." Something moved behind her eyes. Not relief. Not yet. More like she was taking the statement apart to see if it was real, or if there was a cost attached to it that she hadn't identified yet. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "Because someone used my property to defraud you. That's not something I'm willing to leave unresolved. That's not a reason to pay me back personally. You could just report it and let the legal process. The legal process takes months, sometimes years. You paid $4,200 to sleep in an apartment tonight. He glanced at the folder still in her hand. I'm assuming you don't have months. Another silence. Longer this time. She looked at him, really looked, that thorough, careful assessment again. And he had the odd sensation of being read. I'm still calling the police, she said finally. About the fraud. I want that on the record. Absolutely, I'll have my attorney coordinate with whatever detective is assigned. We'll want a parallel civil investigation. Her eyes narrowed slightly. You already know how to do this. I've dealt with fraud before. He paused. Not personally, corporate. Different scale, same mechanics. He looked at the half sandwich still on the counter. Is there more of that, or are you seriously asking me if there's more food in the apartment you own? I haven't eaten since noon and I've been standing in this kitchen for 20 minutes. She stared at him, and then, unexpected, brief, like it surprised her as much as it surprised him, she laughed. Not a full laugh, a short, sharp exhalation that had genuine amusement in it, and she pressed her hand over her mouth like she was trying to take it back. There's bread, she said, and turkey, and I think there's mustard if the previous... She stopped, started again. If you bought mustard, my housekeeper stocks the kitchen. He moved toward the refrigerator. Sit down, you've had a bad 20 minutes. You've also had a bad 20 minutes. I've had a worse 8 months. He said it before he thought about it, and immediately wished he hadn't. He opened the refrigerator, found the turkey, the mustard, a half-empty container of something his housekeeper had clearly left with the best intentions. This isn't how I expected this night to go. Same, Emily said dryly. She'd sat back down. She was watching him make a sandwich in his own kitchen with the expression of someone who had been thoroughly surprised by the evening and was still working out exactly how to feel about it. For what it's worth, she said, the housekeeper stocks good bread. She's particular about bread. I've never understood it. He found a plate, set it on the counter. Tea? You're making tea. You were making tea. I interrupted you. It seems polite to finish what you started. She was quiet for a moment. Second cabinet on the left, she said. There's a box of the regular kind. Done. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. This was the part of the night that Landon would return to later, when he was trying to understand how things had unfolded the way they did. Not the fraud. The fraud was straightforward, the kind of problem that had a clear solution path once you had the right people working it. Not the strangeness of finding a stranger in his apartment, but the sitting, the just sitting, talking. Two people who had every reason to be wary of each other, sitting at a kitchen table with sandwiches and tea, while rain hit the windows and the city did what the city always did. Continued, indifferent, and relentless 41 floors below. Emily, he learned, had been teaching third grade at PS 178 in Washington Heights for 4 years. Before that, she'd been in the Bronx. Before that, she'd done her student teaching in Newark while working 2 other jobs, which she mentioned the way people mention things that shaped them, matter-of-factly, with no performance of hardship, because the hardship was just the weather of her life, and she'd learned to carry an umbrella. She'd moved to this apartment because her previous building had been sold to a developer, and her rent had jumped by $900 in a month. She'd found the listing on a site she'd used before, trusted site, nothing unusual about the process. Martin Cole had been professional, responsive, had sent all the paperwork correctly formatted and signed. The cashier's check photos had matched. The building keys had been real. She'd been using them for 3 weeks. He must have made copies before the sale finalized, Landon said. He was thinking out loud, the way he did when he was working a problem, and he was only partially aware he was doing it. Or had access to the previous locksmith. David will know who handled the last rekeying. He made a note. Martin Cole is probably not his real name, but he knew enough about the property's history to be convincing, which means he had an inside connection to the former owners. The relative, Emily said. What? You just said the former owners, plural, but you meant someone specific. She tilted her head slightly. You already have a person in mind. He looked at her. What makes you say that? You said inside connection to the former owners and your jaw did something. Most people's faces do something when they already know part of the answer, and they're deciding how much to say. She shrugged. Third graders aren't subtle. You learn to read small tells. Landon put his pen down. He wasn't going to tell her the details. Not tonight, not with an investigation pending, but she wasn't wrong. The property's previous owner had been an elderly woman, recently deceased, with a nephew who had contested the sale. The nephew's name was Gerald Holt. Gerald had been angry. Gerald had known the building's history. Gerald had, as far as Landon's attorneys could determine, no legal grounds to do anything about the sale. Apparently, Gerald had found another way. "There's someone my legal team is already aware of," Landon said carefully. "We'll be looking at the connection." Emily nodded. She didn't push for more. He appreciated that. "How long have you been in the building?" she asked instead. "I haven't been. Not since I bought it." He looked at the table. "My mother wanted me to keep it. She grew up in this neighborhood. This building was... She used to stand outside and look at it when she was a kid. She thought it was the most beautiful thing she'd ever seen." He paused. He hadn't meant to say any of that. "She died 8 months ago. Lung cancer. Fast." "I'm sorry," Emily said. Simple, direct, no elaboration. The way someone said it when they meant it and understood that you didn't need them to build a structure around it. "I kept finding reasons not to come back. It felt..." He stopped. "It felt like the kind of thing I should be ready for before I did it, and I was never ready." "What made you come tonight?" He thought about it honestly, which was a thing he did rarely and found uncomfortable. "I don't know," he said. "I just got in the car and told the driver to come here. That was it." Emily was quiet for a moment, then, "I do that sometimes. With my sister's old neighborhood, after she moved away. I drive past it on my way home for no real reason, like there was something I was supposed to pick up there." "Did you ever find it?" "No." She smiled, small and real. "But I stopped needing to, eventually." He didn't respond to that. He looked at his phone. There were 4 missed calls from David, 2 from his attorney, 1 from an unknown number that was probably Gerald Holt having a very bad night of his own. "I have to make some calls," he said. "Of course. You can..." He stopped. This was the part he hadn't worked out. The logical thing, the correct thing, the thing any reasonable person would do, was to tell her he'd arrange a hotel for the night, handle the situation properly, have his attorney reach out in the morning. Clean lines, no complications. He looked at the kitchen, her book on the counter, the mug she'd rinsed and left on the drying rack, the half sandwich she'd wrapped in plastic wrap and put back in the refrigerator with careful precision. "Stay tonight," he said. "The apartment is yours for now. I wasn't using it. We'll figure out the legal situation properly, but there's no reason to..." He stopped again. "You paid rent on this apartment. Even if the transaction was fraudulent, you had a reasonable expectation of occupying it. It would be wrong to make you leave tonight." She looked at him for a long moment, the measuring look again, looking for the cost. "This isn't a thing," he said, and he wasn't sure if he was answering a question she'd asked or one she hadn't. "I'm not... There's nothing expected from this. I'm offering because it's fair, that's all." Emily held his gaze. Whatever she was looking for, she seemed to find enough of it to satisfy her. "Okay," she said quietly. "Tonight. I'll be back tomorrow. With my attorney and whoever David finds at the fraud division. Probably around 10 if that works. I have school until 3:30. 11 then. I'll move it." She nodded. He picked up his phone and his jacket and walked to the front door. He was almost out when she said, "Mr. Pierce." He turned. She was standing in the kitchen doorway again, one shoulder against the frame, her arms crossed loosely, the mug in her hand. The light was behind her, and it caught the loose strands of her hair, and she looked... He would not think about how she looked. He noted it and filed it somewhere he wasn't opening tonight. "Thank you," she said, "for not calling the police the moment you walked in." He thought about it. "I almost did." "I know." She said it without judgment. "Good night, Mr. Pierce." "Landon," he said, because his mother had spent 30 years telling him that making people use his last name was the most efficient way to make them feel like they didn't matter. "Good night, Emily." He sat in the back of the car going home in the rain and did not call David back for a full 12 minutes. He sat and listened to the city and thought about his mother standing at a kitchen window and a woman's voice humming in a dark apartment and the particular way someone laughs when they didn't mean to. Then he called David and started pulling every thread he could find on Gerald Holt. The threads were plentiful, and they were ugly. But the thing Landon kept coming back to later that night, when Mia had been asleep for hours and the apartment was quiet, and he was sitting at his desk with a glass of something he'd barely touched, the thing he kept coming back to was not Gerald Holt. It was the way Emily Brooks had sat at that kitchen table and listened to him talk about his mother without flinching away from the grief in it, without wrapping it in something more comfortable, without giving him a shorter version of her sympathy so she could move on faster. She'd just listened. He hadn't known how much he'd needed that until it happened. He didn't know what to do with that knowledge, so he did what he always did with things he didn't know what to do with. He set it aside very carefully where he could see it but didn't have to decide anything about it yet. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Somewhere across the city, on the 41st floor of a building his mother had once looked up at as a child, a light was still on in the kitchen. He knew this because he'd checked on the security app before he'd gotten in the car. He hadn't known he was going to check until he did. He put his phone down and looked at the ceiling and tried to remember the last time something had genuinely surprised him. It had been a very long time. He hadn't come to the penthouse looking for anything. He'd gone because a dead woman had loved the building, and he'd made a promise he kept running out of courage to keep. But grief, as it turns out, has its own timing, and sometimes the universe doesn't wait for you to be ready. The meeting the next morning did not go the way Landon had planned, which was unusual because Landon's meetings almost always went exactly the way he planned them. His attorney, a sharp-edged woman named Carol Reyes, who had been handling Pierce family legal matters for 11 years, and had the specific kind of patience that comes from repeatedly watching rich men make complicated problems worse by acting too fast. Carol had arrived at 10:58 with a paralegal, a printed copy of Emily's lease, and the expression of someone who had already read the fraud investigator's preliminary report on the drive over and was not pleased by what she'd found. David Chen, his property manager, had arrived separately and was standing near the window looking like he wanted to apologize for something but wasn't sure yet exactly what. Emily had left for school at 7:15. Landon knew this because he'd had his driver bring him to the building at 7, intending to be there before she left, and had arrived in the lobby just in time to see her coming out of the elevator with a canvas bag over one shoulder, a travel mug in her hand, and her hair doing approximately the same thing it had been doing the night before, mostly up, enthusiastically coming down. She'd stopped when she saw him. He'd stopped when he saw her. They'd had about 45 seconds of extremely stilted conversation in the lobby that consisted mostly of him saying the meeting was set for 11 and her saying she knew she'd be back by 3:30, and him saying that was fine, they'd wait, except that wasn't what he'd said at all. He'd said his team would handle the preliminary review in the morning and they'd brief her when she returned, which was more words than the situation required, and none of them were the thing he'd actually meant to say, which was that he was sorry she had to go to work today of all days, after a night like last night. She'd nodded, said thank you, walked out into a gray November morning with the same careful composure she seemed to carry everywhere, like a coat she'd learned to wear so well she'd forgotten she had it on. He'd watched the door close behind her and then stood in the lobby for a beat too long before taking the elevator up. By 11, Carol had laid out the situation with the clean efficiency Landon paid her for. Gerald Holt, the nephew of the building's previous owner, had been systematically angry about the sale of the Whitmore building for the better part of a year. His aunt, Miriam Holt, had sold the building to Landon Pierce's real estate holdings company 18 months ago, 6 months before her death. Gerald had maintained through 2 separate attorneys before both apparently grew tired of his calls, that his aunt had been coerced, that the sale price was below market, and that as a family member he had some unspecified but deeply felt claim on the proceeds. None of these arguments had any legal standing. All of them had been dismissed. Gerald had then, apparently, decided to get creative. The name Martin Cole belonged to a real person, a retired property manager in his 60s living in Boca Raton, who had no knowledge that his identity had been lifted. Gerald had used Cole's identity to set up a fraudulent management company, list the Penthouse unit on 3 separate rental platforms under slightly different addresses to avoid duplicate flagging, and collect deposits and first-month payments from at least 4 prospective tenants over a period of 6 weeks. Emily was the only one who had actually moved in. The other 3 had signed leases and paid deposits but hadn't yet taken possession. Two of them had, in fact, already contacted police when their supposed move-in date was met with a door that didn't open. 4 victims that we know of, Carol said, setting a summary sheet on the kitchen table. Combined loss of approximately $14,000. Emily Brooks's portion is the largest individual amount. She paused. She also appears to have had the most complete documentation and the only physical tenancy, which makes her the strongest witness in any prosecution. What's the timeline on getting her money back? Landon asked. If Gerald is prosecuted and convicted, restitution could take, not through prosecution, through us. He looked at Carol. I want her $4,200 back in her account within 48 hours. Draw it from the building operations fund, and we'll recover it when Gerald is held liable. Carol wrote something down without changing her expression, which was how she indicated she had opinions she was choosing not to voice. I'll draft the transfer authorization. David, from his position near the window, finally said what he'd been building up to since he arrived. I should have flagged that the unit had been accessed. There were entry logs. The fake Cole had a copied key, used it twice in the week before Ms. Brooks moved in, presumably to stage the apartment well enough for a showing. I missed it. He looked at Landon directly. That's on me. I should have caught it. I know, Landon said. Not unkindly, but without softening it either. Make sure it doesn't happen again. David nodded once, tight and professional. Carol went on. The fraud division contact, a detective named Okafor, was already pulling Gerald's financial records. The fake management company's bank account had been set up through an online institution, and the money was likely already moved, but the digital trail was traceable. Gerald Holt was not, by all accounts, a sophisticated criminal. He was a bitter, financially struggling middle-aged man who had tried something desperate and done it badly enough that it would unravel quickly. He didn't think about the tenant actually moving in, Landon said. No, Carol agreed. He probably expected to collect the deposits and disappear before anyone took physical possession. Ms. Brooks moving in 3 weeks early, her previous landlord apparently accelerated the move-out date, seems to have caught him off guard. Landon thought about that for a moment. Emily's previous landlord had pushed her out early. She'd moved into a fraudulent apartment because her real one had been taken from her first. One bad thing leading to another, the way they tended to for people who didn't have the cushion to absorb the impact. Get it done, he said. All of it. Carol and David left at 12:30. Landon stayed. He wasn't sure why, exactly. He had a 2 o'clock he'd already rescheduled twice and really couldn't push again. He had 17 unopened emails that his assistant had flagged as urgent, which in practice meant 12 of them were her definition of urgent and 5 of them actually were. He had a daughter who'd been asking him for 2 weeks if they could get a dog, and he'd been saying he'd think about it, which both of them understood meant no, but he was trying to find a kinder way to say it. He stayed and sat at the kitchen table and looked at the city through the window and thought about nothing in particular for the better part of an hour. When Emily got home at 3:47, 12 minutes later than she'd said, because the crosstown bus had done what crosstown buses in Manhattan did in November, which was arrive whenever it felt like it, she found him at the table with a cold cup of coffee and his jacket over the back of the chair. She stopped just inside the door, looked at him. You're still here. Carol left a copy of the documentation for you to review. He gestured at the folder on the table. I wanted to walk you through it. She set her bag down. She looked tired in the specific way teachers look tired. Not physically exhausted exactly, but like she'd been pouring from a vessel that hadn't been refilled recently. She sat down across from him, pulled the folder toward her, and opened it. He walked her through it. All of it. Gerald Holt, Martin Cole's stolen identity, the other victims, the fraud division, the timeline. She listened without interrupting, which he was beginning to understand was a characteristic thing she did. Let people finish before she responded, which in his experience was rarer than it should have been. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, looking at the summary page. 4 other people, she said. 3 other victims. You're the 4th. And I'm the one who actually moved in. She absorbed that. So he had no idea I was here. Almost certainly not. When I showed up last night, he probably thought the apartment had been sitting empty. She closed the folder. 4,200, she said, mostly to herself. Her voice was even. I saved that for 8 months. He didn't say anything. There wasn't anything useful to say. 8 months of not buying coffee at the place near school, she continued. Not fixing my laptop keyboard. The K key's been stuck for a year. It's honestly impressive how creative you get around a broken K. She stopped herself, let out a short breath. Sorry, I'm not trying to make you feel guilty. You didn't do this. Gerald Holt did this. Right. She looked at the window. The money being returned in 48 hours, that's you, isn't it? Not the legal process. It's the Building Operations Fund, which you own. He didn't answer. Landon. She said his name like she was picking it up and checking its weight. It was the first time she'd used it. I'm going to pay that back. When the restitution comes through, whenever that is, I'll pay it back. That's not necessary. It is to me. Her eyes were steady on him. I'm not in a position to accept $4,000 as a gift from someone I met 20 hours ago. That's just the truth. I'll pay it back. He held her gaze. She meant it. He could see she meant every word of it, that this was not performative pride but something structural in her, something built over a long time from the necessity of being the only person she could reliably count on. Breaking that structure, even to accept something she needed, felt dangerous to her in ways that probably didn't make complete rational sense but were real regardless. Okay, he said. She blinked, seemed to have expected more resistance. Okay? Okay, you'll pay it back. When the restitution comes through. He picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. Do you want actual coffee? There's a machine. I don't know how it works, but I know how it works. And she was already standing. I've been using it for 3 weeks. Sit down. I'll make it. And that was how they ended up at the kitchen table again. The second day in a row, which neither of them commented on, because commenting on it would have required acknowledging something they weren't ready to name yet. She made the coffee. He told her about the next steps with the fraud investigation. She told him, with the resigned humor of someone who'd made peace with absurdity, about the third grader who had that morning submitted a book report on a book he had clearly not read, based on it being a detailed summary of the movie version with the main character's name spelled 4 different ways. He laughed, actually laughed, the involuntary kind, and she looked up from her mug with a small expression of surprise, like the laugh had been something she hadn't expected from him and was quietly pleased by. He left at 5:15. He had a dinner, a real one, a charity board thing he'd committed to in September and couldn't cancel without consequences. He told her that his attorney would be in touch, that she should call if anything came up, that the apartment was hers for as long as the legal situation needed to resolve. You keep saying that, she said. The apartment is yours, stay as long as you need. But this is your apartment. That's a significant thing to just keep offering. It was sitting empty. It was sitting empty because you weren't ready to be in it. She said it quietly, without accusation. You told me that last night. He paused with his hand on his jacket. Yes. So why does it feel less uncomfortable now than it did yesterday? He thought about it. Actually thought about it rather than deflecting. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe because last night I came here alone and the apartment was dark, and today I came here and someone had made coffee. Emily looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at the kitchen, the counter, the window, the mug drying on the rack. The same things he'd noticed the night before, arranged with the same quiet economy. Okay, she said softly. She wasn't talking about the apartment, exactly. He wasn't sure what she was talking about, and he didn't ask. He left. He was in the elevator before he realized he'd forgotten to give her Carol's direct number. He thought about going back. He texted it to her instead. She replied, "Thank you. Good luck with the dinner." He hadn't told her he had a dinner. He was still working out how she'd known that when his driver pulled up at the curb. The building took shape around Emily over the following 2 weeks, the way places do when you decide, quietly and without ceremony, to actually live in them. Not just occupy them, actually live. She knew in the practical sense that her situation here was temporary. She knew in the practical sense that she was occupying an apartment that belonged to someone else under unusual circumstances, that were still being sorted by attorneys and fraud investigators and people whose jobs required a great deal of paperwork. She knew all of this. And yet she found herself on a Saturday morning 12 days after the night Landon Pierce had walked into his kitchen and found her making tea, rearranging the living room furniture. Not dramatically, just the reading chair had been facing the wall, which made no sense. She moved it 45 degrees toward the window. The side table that had been serving no purpose in the corner of the room turned out to be exactly the right height for a lamp. She didn't own a lamp, but she could get one. There was a good second-hand shop on Amsterdam Avenue. She'd walked past it twice and noted it the way she noted things she couldn't justify buying, which was how she'd been buying furniture for years, cataloging, waiting, eventually deciding. She got the lamp. She brought it back on the subway, which was an adventure in its own right, and set it up in the living room, and sat in the reading chair with it on and her book in her lap and thought, this is nice. Then she felt guilty for thinking it was nice because it wasn't her apartment, and feeling at home in someone else's space seemed like a line she should be careful about crossing. She crossed it anyway, a little, because she was tired of not having a home, and this one, even borrowed, even temporary, felt like one. Landon came on a Thursday evening, unannounced, with his daughter. This was not something Emily had been prepared for. She'd opened the door expecting... She didn't know what she'd been expecting. Maybe David with another piece of paperwork, maybe a wrong floor situation, and found Landon standing in the hallway, looking slightly like he'd arrived somewhere, and was reconsidering whether he should have, and beside him, holding his hand with the easy unself-consciousness of someone very young, a small girl. She was about 9, dark-haired like her father, wearing a red coat that had a small paint stain on the left sleeve, and looking up at Emily with the completely unfiltered, unashamed curiosity that 9-year-olds brought to every new situation. "Hi," the girl said. "Hi," Emily said. "I'm Mia." She said it like it settled something. "My dad said a lady lives here now. He didn't say you were a teacher." Emily looked at Landon. "She goes to school 3 blocks from here," he said, with the expression of a man who was explaining something and knew the explanation didn't entirely cover it. "I was picking her up and I thought..." He stopped, started again. "I should have called. Dad said he forgot to give you something." Mia had released his hand and was now looking past Emily into the apartment with open interest. He didn't say what. He said it a lot of times in the car, like at least 4 times. "We forgot, Mia. We need to stop, Mia." Landon's jaw moved. Emily stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. She made tea. Mia, upon discovering that Emily taught 3rd grade, immediately launched into a detailed and only partially coherent account of everything that was wrong with her current teacher, which Emily listened to with the professional patience of someone who had heard approximately 1 million versions of this exact speech, and understood that 50% of it was genuine grievance, 30% was exaggeration, and the remaining 20% was a 9-year-old testing how much an adult would actually listen. She listened to all of it. Mia sat at the kitchen counter on a bar stool she'd climbed onto herself without asking, elbows on the surface, talking with both hands. She had a liveliness to her that was partly just being 9, and partly something that seemed specific, the kind of energy a child gets when they've been in a quiet house for a long time, and suddenly there's someone new in the room. Landon sat at the table. He was supposed to be on his phone. He'd had it out when he came in, something about a call he needed to return. But he wasn't looking at it. He was watching Mia talk. Emily noticed. The thing about watching a parent watch their child, really watch them, with the particular quality of attention that doesn't get performed, that just happens, is that it told you things. Landon Pierce in a boardroom was probably one version of himself. Landon Pierce sitting at a kitchen table watching his 9-year-old daughter tell a stranger about the injustice of assigned seating was a different one. Quieter, less constructed. The grief he'd mentioned the first night sat in his posture differently here, not as something heavy he was carrying, but as something he'd set down for the moment, and was grateful to have set down. "She loves talking," he said quietly, during a gap created by Mia going to investigate whether there was anything interesting in the refrigerator. "She's been quieter than usual this year, since my mother." "They were close?" "Mia doesn't remember her mother. My ex-wife left when she was 2. He said it with a flat matter-of-factness that told her it was old hurt, handled but not gone. "My mother was She was the primary female presence in Mia's life. She's the one who took her to school when I was traveling, the one who knew which bedtime books she liked. All of that." He paused. "She took it harder than she lets on. She doesn't want to upset me." Emily thought about that, about a 9-year-old carrying grief quietly to protect her parent. "She's perceptive. Too perceptive." He looked at the refrigerator where Mia was now inspecting the contents with the focused intensity of a scientist. She told me last month that I seem sad all the time, but I try to act busy so she doesn't worry. She said it the way kids say things, just directly. Like she wanted me to know she knew. What did you say? I said she was right, that I was sad and I was working on it, and that she didn't need to protect me. He looked back at the table. She nodded like she didn't fully believe me, but was willing to let it go for now. That sounds right. Dad, Mia called from the refrigerator. There's leftover pasta. Can Emily have us for dinner? That's not how that works, Landon said. Why not?
Because sarking.
Because you don't invite yourself to dinner at someone else's apartment by pointing at their refrigerator. Mia considered this seriously, turned to Emily. Can we stay for dinner? Emily looked at Landon. He looked at Emily. His expression carried a very specific kind of parental resignation that was approximately 60% embarrassment and 40% trying very hard not to find it funny. There's enough pasta, Emily said. Mia pumped her fist. They stayed for dinner. They stayed past dinner. Mia found a deck of cards and demanded a card game, the rules of which she invented on the spot and modified whenever it suited her, which was often. Landon played along with the specific patience of someone who had been playing invented games with modified rules for 9 years and had made his peace with it. Emily watched them. She watched how Landon shuffled the cards she'd asked him to shuffle and then immediately accused him of cheating, and how he took the accusation with a straight face while she turned away to arrange her own hand, and how the corner of his mouth moved, a small, private thing, when she wasn't looking. She watched how Mia tilted toward him without thinking about it, the way children tilt toward safe things, an unconscious gravity. She watched all of it and felt quietly the particular ache of recognizing something good and knowing it wasn't hers. They left at 8:30. Mia hugged Emily at the door without warning, just stepped forward and put her arms around Emily's waist with the complete conviction of someone who had decided something and was acting on it. Emily's hands came up and held her, and for a second she didn't say anything. Good night, Mia said into her sweater. Good night, Mia. She let go, stepped back, and went to stand beside her father in the hallway. Landon looked at Emily with an expression she couldn't quite catalog, something unguarded, something that had arrived without him planning for it. Thank you for the pasta, he said. Thank your 9-year-old. He almost smiled. Yeah. He glanced down at Mia, then back. Good night, Emily. Good night. She closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment, in the quiet apartment with the lamp on in the living room and the card game still spread across the coffee table. She cleaned up the cards, put them back in the box, washed the pasta bowls. Then she sat in the reading chair by the window and tried very hard to think about something other than the look on Landon Pierce's face when he said goodnight. She was not entirely successful. The legal proceedings moved faster than she'd expected, which Carol Reyes said was because Gerald Holt's paper trail was embarrassingly obvious, and his attorney had called twice suggesting a plea arrangement, which suggested Gerald understood the situation he was in. The money arrived in Emily's account on a Wednesday morning, $4,200 exactly. She stared at her banking app for a full minute, standing in the school bathroom between her second and third period class, aware that she should be moving and unable to make herself go anywhere yet. She'd text him, she decided. Not a call. A call felt like too much. She would text. It came through. Thank you. I'll start the repayment as soon as the restitution. She deleted that. Too formal. The money is here. Thank you. She sent it. Simple. She'd overthought it to simplicity, and that seemed right. His reply came at noon when she was eating lunch at her desk because parent-teacher conferences were next week, and she had about 40 pages of notes she needed to organize. Good. How's the K-key? She looked at her phone. Then she started laughing, quietly, alone in her classroom, in the particular helpless way that happens when you're tired and something catches you off guard. Still broken, she typed back. Keyboard looks like it was written by someone with a very specific fear of the 11th letter. 3 dots appeared, disappeared. Then, I'll have someone look at it. You don't have to do that. I know. What time do you finish tonight? She looked at the question for a moment longer than it warranted. 6. Why? Mia has been asking when she can see you again. I told her that wasn't something I could just schedule. She told me I was wrong. Emily put her phone down. looked at the parent-teacher conference notes, picked up her phone. She's probably right, she typed. 6:30. I'll make something that isn't pasta. The 3 dots again. Then, she'll be very pleased. She's going through a phase where pasta feels like giving up. Tell her ambitious. What? Tell her pasta is ambitious. Third graders respond better to reframing than to facts. A longer pause. Then, that actually worked. She wants to know if you like chicken. Emily set her phone face down on the desk and looked at the ceiling of her classroom. The water stain in the left corner that had been there all year, the motivational poster someone had put up that said, "Believe in your potential," in letters so large they'd become invisible through sheer repetition, and understood, with the calm clarity of someone watching weather arrive on the horizon, that she was in some kind of trouble here. Not bad trouble. Not dangerous trouble. Just the quiet, unsettling trouble of realizing that a situation you'd assumed was temporary had started feeling necessary. She picked up her phone. I like chicken, she typed. She put it away. Went back to her conference notes. Tried to concentrate. The lamp was on in the living room when she got home at 6:17 because she'd left it on. But the apartment felt less empty than it had 2 weeks ago, and she didn't bother pretending she didn't know why. She started on the chicken at 6:20. By 6:53, Mia's voice was already in the hallway. Emily wiped her hands on a dish towel, took a breath, and went to open the door. December arrived the way it always did in New York. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once. Like the city had been holding its breath through November, and finally exhaled in a single cold blast that turned everyone's commute into a minor ordeal and made the steam rising from the subway grates look almost beautiful if you caught it at the right angle. Emily had lived through 12 Manhattan Decembers. She knew how they worked. She knew the particular quality of cold that came off the Hudson when the wind was heading east, knew the way the streets smelled different once the first real snow hit and then melted and refroze into something gray and permanent along the curbs. She knew all of it. What she didn't know was how it would feel to experience it from the 41st floor, in an apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and heating that actually worked, with a lamp she'd bought for $12 on Amsterdam Avenue and a card game permanently living on the coffee table because Mia kept showing up and demanding rematches. It felt, honestly, a little surreal, like she was living in someone else's life and hadn't quite worked out whether she was borrowing it or being lent it, or something else entirely that didn't have a clean word. Landon came on Tuesdays and Thursdays, usually with Mia, sometimes alone when his daughter had an after-school activity or a sleepover. He always had a reason. Paperwork from Carol, something the building manager needed signed. A question about the fraud investigation timeline. The reasons were real, she didn't doubt that. But they were also, she'd begun to notice, slightly more frequent than they strictly needed to be. She didn't say anything about it. She made dinner or coffee or whatever the evening called for, and they sat and they talked. And it was, the word she kept arriving at was easy, which surprised her every time she arrived at it, because nothing about Landon Pierce suggested easy. He was contained in a way that read as closed off until you'd spent enough time with him to understand it was more like a city that didn't put up tourist signs. You had to actually walk around in it before anything became familiar. She was starting to find her way around. He asked questions, real ones, not conversational ones. He wanted to know about her students, specific ones she'd mentioned, and remembered what she'd said about them from week to week. He wanted to know about her sister, who'd moved to Portland 2 years ago and called every Sunday and was the only person in Emily's life who had been told the full, unedited version of the Gerald Holt situation. He wanted to know about the stuck K key, which had been fixed. Someone from his building maintenance team had appeared at the door on a Saturday morning with a small toolkit and the polite professionalism of a person who had been sent on an errand and was going to complete it without asking any questions. Emily had stood in the doorway and watched him replace the key and thought, this is what it looks like when resources are infinite and someone decides to use them for something small. She told Landon the key was fixed that Tuesday. He'd said, good. She'd said, you didn't have to do that. He'd said, I know, and moved on to something else, and she'd understood that was how he operated. He did things and didn't particularly want credit for them, which was either very evolved or a habit formed by growing up in a world where everything he did was watched and weighted, and she suspected it was mostly the latter. On the second Thursday of December, he came alone. Mia had a school winter concert rehearsal that ran until 8, and he dropped her off and then, apparently, come straight here. He looked tired in a way he didn't usually let show. She noticed it when he came in, the particular tired that wasn't physical, wasn't lack of sleep, but was the tired of carrying something for a long time without putting it down. She didn't ask immediately. She made coffee. She asked about the rehearsal, what Mia was performing, what instrument. She'd been told violin, but wasn't sure she'd remembered correctly. Violin, he confirmed, dropping into the chair at the kitchen table with the involuntary relief of someone who'd been standing all day. She started 3 years ago. My mother pushed for it. I thought it would last about 6 weeks before she lost interest. He paused. She's actually good, which I say as someone with no ability to judge, but her teacher says it too and seems genuine about it. Kids who are perceptive usually take to instruments, Emily said. They hear things other kids miss. She hear things I miss, definitely. He looked at his coffee. She told me last week that I'm different when I'm here than when I'm at home. Emily set her own mug down. Different how? Less far away, she said. He turned the mug in his hands. A habit, she'd noticed. He turned things when he was working something out. She said at home I'm always a little bit somewhere else, even when I'm in the room, but here, I'm just here. He looked up. That was her exact phrase, just here. Emily didn't respond immediately. The refrigerator made its small sound in the background, traffic somewhere below, muffled by the height and the glass. She's right, isn't she? Emily said. Not a question. Yeah. He said it like it cost him something to admit. I don't know how to explain it. I've been going through the right motions for 8 months. Since my mother. I go to work, I come home, I'm there for Mia, I'm going through all the correct steps of being a present father, and somewhere in the last 8 months, I've managed to become genuinely good at faking being okay while not being okay. He stopped. I don't usually say this out loud. I know. To anyone. I know. She looked at him steadily. What happened tonight that made you say it now? Another moment. I had a board meeting today. Quarterly review, all the standard things. And at one point I was presenting the development projections for the spring, and I realized I had no memory of preparing the presentation. I'd clearly done it. It was there. It was good. My assistant said it was the best one we'd had all year. But I had no recollection of sitting down and building it. I did it completely on autopilot. He was quiet. That's been happening more. I do things. They get done. I don't remember being present for any of it. Emily thought about her first year after her father left, when she'd been 16 and had somehow still turned in all her homework and kept her grades up and done everything she was supposed to do while existing in a fog so complete she still had gaps in her memory of entire months. The body kept moving when the person inside it went somewhere else. That was a thing that happened. That's grief, she said. It doesn't go away because you keep moving. It just moves underneath everything and runs the machinery for a while. He looked at her. You sound like you know. I do know. Not a parent, but she paused, deciding how much to say. My dad left when I was 16. He didn't die. He just left, which is its own category of thing. I spent the next 2 years doing everything right from the outside and being completely absent from the inside. She turned her mug. You learn to surface eventually, but it takes longer than people expect it to, and you can't rush it. Landon was quiet for a moment. My mother would tell me I'm being an idiot, he said finally. She had a very specific way of being compassionate that involved calling you out on your own nonsense in the same breath. He almost smiled, a real one, small and unguarded. She'd say, Landon, the grief is real, but you're using it as an excuse to not show up. And she'd be right. She was usually right. What would you say back? I'd say she was annoying. The almost smile became briefly, actually real. And she'd say, I know, now get up. Emily watched that smile, watched it arrive and stay for a few seconds and then settle back into something quieter, but not entirely gone. Get up, she said softly. Not instructional, more like an echo or a reminder. He looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said, differently than before, like something had slightly shifted. The concert was on a Friday evening 2 weeks later, in the auditorium of Mia's school on the Upper West Side, a school that occupied a converted brownstone and had the particular smell of old wood and chalk that Emily associated viscerally with every school she'd ever been in, which gave her an immediate, uncomplicated fondness for it. She wasn't sure how she'd ended up being invited. There had been no formal invitation. Mia had called her on Landon's phone on a Sunday afternoon to talk about, ostensibly, a book Emily had lent her, and at the end of the call had mentioned the concert, mentioned the date, mentioned that it would be nice if Emily came, and then moved on to a completely different topic before Emily could respond, which was either masterful or entirely unconscious, and Emily suspected it was the latter. She'd texted Landon afterward. Was that a setup? His reply had taken 4 minutes, which meant he'd been deciding how to word it. She mentioned it on her own. I didn't tell her to, but I also didn't tell her not to. Emily had stared at that for a while. Okay, she'd replied. What time does it start? She sat in the third row between Landon and an empty seat Mia had insisted be reserved for reasons she hadn't explained. The auditorium was exactly the right kind of chaotic. Programs being passed around, small children in formal clothes running the specific kind of backstage panic that happened when 30 third graders were trying to remember where they were supposed to stand, a father 2 rows back already filming on his phone even though nothing had started yet. Landon was sitting very still in the way that told her he was paying attention to everything. You okay? She asked. My mother came to every concert, he said. Every recital, every school event, even the ones that were 45 minutes long and involved 30 children playing hot cross buns in sequence. He looked at the empty stage. This is the first one since. Emily didn't say anything. She just moved her arm on the armrest so her elbow was close to his, not touching, but near, and left it there. The lights went down. Mia was in the second violin section, 4th from the left, wearing a dark dress she'd clearly had an opinion about. It was slightly less formal than the others, and had small embroidered flowers at the collar that she had almost certainly added herself. She found Emily and her father in the audience in about 30 seconds, with the instinctive radar children had for the faces they were looking for, and gave them a wave that was supposed to be subtle and was not. The music started. It wasn't perfect. It was a school concert. There were wobbling notes and one memorable moment when the entire brass section came in approximately half a beat early. But Mia was steady. She played with the specific concentration of a child who wasn't performing for the audience but for the music itself, chin tucked over the rest, bow arm moving with the controlled deliberateness of someone who'd been told 100 times to watch the pressure. Landon watched her the whole time. Emily watched him watch her. He wasn't going to cry. She could see him holding himself very carefully, the specific stillness of someone who has decided something about how they're going to get through the next 45 minutes. But at one point, during the third piece, a slow, unexpectedly moving arrangement of something Emily half recognized, his jaw moved, and he looked at the ceiling briefly, and then back at the stage, and she saw him take a slow breath in and let it out. She put her hand on the armrest between them. Just her hand, open, not reaching for anything. A moment later, his hand was beside hers. Not holding it, not quite. Just beside it. Edges almost touching. They stayed that way through the rest of the concert. Mia came out of the backstage door at the end with the violin under her arm and the concentrated energy of someone who has been patient for a very long time and is done being patient now. She got to them in about 4 steps. She hugged her father first, hard, arms around his waist, face against his coat, and then, without letting go of him, turned and grabbed Emily's hand. Emily held her hand and thought, "Be careful." The thought was not about Mia. The Pierce Foundation Charity Gala was not, in Emily's life, the kind of event she attended. She'd been to 2 galas in her adult life, one for a literacy nonprofit that one of her teacher colleagues had dragged her to, at which she'd worn a dress borrowed from her sister and spent most of the evening by the shrimp cocktail station, and one for a neighborhood association fundraiser that had called itself a gala, but was really a crowded community center with better-than-usual punch. Those were her gala experiences. She'd agreed to this one because Landon had asked her in a way that was direct, without being pressuring, which she'd come to understand was his characteristic mode. He didn't manipulate, didn't angle, just said the thing he meant and waited. He'd said the foundation did real work that he cared about, that it would be a long evening and he'd prefer not to spend it alone, and that she could leave whenever she wanted and he'd arrange the car. She'd said yes, which she'd told herself was because the foundation's work, arts education in underfunded schools, was something she genuinely believed in and would have supported in any context. That was probably 60% true. She'd borrowed a dress from her sister, who had reacted to the phone call about the gala by going completely silent for 5 seconds and then saying in a very careful voice, "Emily, I need you to tell me everything right now. Do not skip anything." And had it overnighted from Portland because her sister had better taste and a more formal wardrobe from years of fundraising dinners in the nonprofit sector. The dress was deep green, fitted, not dramatic. It was the kind of dress that looked like you'd thought about it without wanting people to know you'd thought about it. Landon's expression when she came out of the elevator in the lobby, she'd gotten ready at the apartment and he'd met her downstairs, told her the dress had accomplished what it set out to do. He said nothing, just looked at her for half a second longer than the situation required, and then said, "The car's outside," which was, she was learning, how Landon said a lot of things. The gala was held in a midtown venue that had been designed to make wealthy people feel comfortable spending large amounts of money. Floor-to-ceiling windows, lighting calibrated to make everyone look their best, food and open bar arranged so that the ambient mood was permanently 1 degree above comfortable. Emily recognized the engineering of it immediately, having spent enough time studying classroom environments to understand that space was never neutral. She was also, she would admit privately, a little overwhelmed, not by the room she could handle, by the people in it, by the way conversation shifted when Landon walked through, the acknowledgments, the hands extended, the names and faces she had no context for, the specific social choreography of a room full of people who all knew the same 20% of the same other people and spent events like this navigating the implications. Landon moved through it easily. Not coldly. He was engaged when engaged with, laughed when something was actually funny, introduced Emily clearly and without over-explaining her presence. But he moved through the room like someone who had been doing this his whole life and found it useful rather than enjoyable, which she suspected was accurate. She stayed close, not attached, and watched. About an hour in, while Landon was briefly pulled into a conversation with a foundation board member, and she'd found a slightly quieter spot near the window with a glass of something decent and a clear view of the city below, a woman appeared beside her, 50s, silver hair, wearing a dress that cost more than Emily's monthly rent, without trying to look like it. "You're not like the others," the woman said, without preamble, as if they were continuing a conversation. Emily looked at her. "I'm sorry?" "The women he usually brings to these things, when he used to bring women to these things." The woman sipped her drink with the casual authority of someone who said whatever they thought and had never been particularly penalized for it. "They were either very polished or very young, which in my experience often means the same thing. You're neither." She looked at Emily with frank curiosity. "You're looking at the room like you're trying to figure out how it works. Isn't that what you do in a room you don't know?" The woman smiled. "Most people in rooms they don't know try to look like they do. You're just actually looking." She extended her hand. "Patricia Huang. I've been on the foundation board since Landon's mother founded it." Emily shook her hand. "Emily Brooks." "I know who you are," Patricia said. Emily must have done something with her face because Patricia added, "Not in a surveillance way. He mentioned you at the last board meeting. Said the foundation was doing important work in arts education, which he said before. But then he said he'd been reminded recently why it mattered, which he's never said before." She studied Emily with the look of someone who'd been reading people in board meetings for 30 years. "You teach 3rd grade?" "Yes." His mother would have liked that. She said it simply, looking back at the room. She was a school teacher, elementary school, before she married his father, before any of this. She gestured, vaguely encompassing the room and everything it represented. "He doesn't talk about her much publicly, but she's in everything he builds." Emily followed her gaze across the room to where Landon was standing. He'd finished the conversation with the board member and was now listening to someone else, standing with that particular quality of attention he had, where his whole body oriented toward whoever was speaking. "The apartment he bought," Patricia continued, "she grew up a block from it. Did you know that?" He mentioned she loved the building. She used to tell him she stood outside it as a girl and imagined what it would be like to live somewhere like that. He bought it 6 months before she died. She was too sick to ever see inside it. Patricia looked at her glass. "I think that's why he couldn't go back. He bought it so she could see it, and then she couldn't, and going there meant standing inside a gift that was never received." Emily was quiet for a moment. Something she'd half understood clicked more fully into place. "He came back," she said finally. "Yes," Patricia said. "He did." Landon found her 20 minutes later, having navigated free of the board conversation and apparently 2 other conversations she'd missed. He appeared beside her with a plate of food she hadn't asked for and hadn't known she wanted and set it on the windowsill between them. "You talked to Patricia Huang," he said. "She found me." "She finds everyone. It's a skill." "What did she say?" Emily looked at the city below, the particular beauty of Manhattan at night from height, all that light contained and purposeful. "She told me your mother was a school teacher." He was quiet for a second. "I don't usually lead with that." "Why not?" "Because people react to it as a story rather than a fact. It becomes..." He paused, choosing words. "It becomes a narrative about how I got where I got, and I don't like my mother being a narrative." Emily understood that. "She wasn't trying to make her a narrative," she said. "I think she was just telling me she knew your mother, and that she'd have liked me." He turned to look at her. Not his assessing look, not his professional look. The one she'd seen at the concert. The one that didn't have a name yet, but that she recognized by now. "She would have," he said. The dinner program began at 9, and Landon was on the agenda. A brief address, something he'd written himself, Carol had told her, and rewritten twice. He hadn't mentioned it to Emily. She found out when the MC introduced him, and he stood, buttoned his jacket with the small unconscious gesture of someone steeling themselves, and walked to the front of the room. He was good at this. She could see. He had the presence, the voice, the controlled stillness that read as authority. He thanked the foundation's partners, acknowledged the work being done in schools across the city, said the correct things with genuine enough delivery that the room stayed with him. And then he stopped. It was a brief stop, maybe 2 seconds, but it was distinct, a pause that was different from the others, and she saw him look at his notes and then away from them. 8 months ago, he said, I was going through the motions of my life in a way I was entirely unaware of. I'd lost someone. My mother, this foundation's founder, a woman who believed that giving a child access to art was not a luxury, but a right. And I'd done what I'd taught myself to do in difficult situations. I kept moving, I kept building, I kept managing. He paused again. Someone recently told me that grief doesn't go away because you keep moving. It moves underneath everything and runs the machinery for a while. He looked up from the notes he'd now stopped using entirely. I'm still in the machinery phase, I think, but I've been reminded in unexpected ways why the work matters, why she built this, what a teacher actually does for a child that no spreadsheet or development projection can measure. A beat. My daughter played the violin at her school concert last week. It was the first one since my mother died. And it was... He stopped again. Shorter pause. It was very good. Light laughter from the room. He waited for it to settle. Give kids art, he said. Give them music, give them stories, give them the things that make life legible. That's what this foundation does. That's what she believed. I'm still trying to be worthy of that. He picked up his glass. Thank you. The room applauded. Emily's hands were moving with everyone else's. She was looking at the table. Across the table, Patricia Huang caught her eye and gave her a small, knowing nod that Emily decided not to interpret too carefully. In the car afterward, they were both quiet for a few blocks. The city moved past the windows. The driver was a discreet presence behind the partition. The grief moving underneath the machinery, he said. You said that. I did. I should have told you I was going to use it. I didn't mind. He looked at her. You're sure? It was true when I said it. Still true. If it helped someone in that room, that's better than it just sitting in my kitchen. He was quiet for a moment. Patricia Huang said I seem different this year, less like I'm managing everything from a distance. Is she right? She's right, he said simply. He looked at the city passing outside. You did that. Emily looked at her hands in her lap. I didn't do anything. You talked to me, he said, like I was a regular person. You didn't calculate how to handle me. You didn't treat me like a situation to be managed. You just talked, asked questions that weren't positioned. He paused. You don't know how unusual that is. She thought about all the things she could say, She thought about Patricia Huang saying he's different, and Mia saying just here and the way he'd looked at the empty stage before the concert started. "You talked back," she said finally. "You didn't have to. Most people with a lot of walls don't." "I didn't notice I was doing it." "I know." She looked at him. "That's how it works, usually. The real conversations." The car was 2 blocks from the Penthouse. She could see the building from here, the familiar shape of it against the December sky, the particular floor where a lamp was on because she'd left it on, the lit square of the kitchen window. "I don't want to go back to the way things were before October," he said quietly. "Before I came back here and found you in the kitchen." He wasn't looking at her when he said it, looking at the building. "I don't know what to do with that exactly. I haven't done this well in the past, whatever this is." "Neither have I," she said honestly. "Then we're both bad at it." "Probably." He looked at her then. She looked back. 2 people in the back of a car being honest about the fact that they were frightened of something they also didn't want to stop. "Okay," he said. Same word he'd used the morning after, when she'd told him she'd pay back the money, and he'd said okay without arguing. Just, "Okay, I hear you. I'll accept the terms." "Okay," she said back. The car stopped. The driver opened the door. The cold air came in, sharp and real, and they walked into the building together in the particular way of people who haven't said everything yet, but have said enough for tonight. The elevator opened on 41. She unlocked the door. The lamp was on in the living room, the card game still on the coffee table from Tuesday. The apartment smelled like whatever candles she'd lit earlier. A cheap one, vanilla, a luxury she'd allowed herself once the first month's paycheck had hit. "Do you want coffee?" she asked. He should have said no. He had a 7 a.m. call and a daughter to get home to. She knew all of this and asked anyway, and she wasn't sure whether she was hoping he'd say yes or hoping he'd say no, because both answers led somewhere she was trying to navigate carefully. "Yeah," he said, 1 cup. She went to the kitchen. She heard him sit at the table, the familiar sound of the chair, the small sounds of the apartment settling around a person. She put the kettle on and stood with her back to the archway and thought about a night 6 weeks ago when she'd been the one making tea and he'd been the stranger standing in the doorway, and how completely unrecognizable that evening was from the inside of this one. She turned around. He was at the table, jacket off, looking at the card game with the expression of someone reading something they'd forgotten they'd written. "Mia's going to want a rematch on Saturday," he said. "I know. She texted me." He looked up. "She texted you. She said you were letting her win on purpose, and it wasn't helping her improve." He was quiet for a second. "I absolutely let her win on purpose." "I know. I told her you were being strategic." "And?" Emily turned back to the counter. "She said you could be strategic all you wanted as long as she got to win." She heard him laugh. The real one. The involuntary kind. The kind she'd first heard at the kitchen table 6 weeks ago, and that still occasionally caught her off guard by how much she wanted to hear it again. She poured the coffee, carried both mugs to the table, sat across from him. Outside, the December city did its constant, indifferent, beautiful thing. The 41st floor held them, suspended above it. They drank their coffee. They talked about nothing important and some things that were. He left at 11:15 with a text already typed to the nanny and his jacket folded over his arm. And at the door he paused. Not the calculated pause of someone composing themselves, but the genuine pause of someone who has something they're not saying and is deciding whether tonight is the night. Tonight was not the night. She could see him decide that. She was relieved and disappointed in equal measure. "Good night, Emily," he said. "Good night." He left. She closed the door. She stood in the living room with the card game on the table and the lamp on and the vanilla candle burning low, and thought, "Be careful." And then, more quietly, underneath that, but not too careful, she picked up the mugs, carried them to the kitchen, and washed them slowly in the quiet apartment, with the December city 41 floors below, going on without her. The lease expired on a Thursday, not the fraudulent one that had been legally voided in November, rendered null by Carol Reyes in 3 paragraphs of clean, unambiguous language that had also, incidentally, served as part of the documentation package that put Gerald Holt in a room with a detective and a very uncomfortable morning. The lease Emily was thinking about now was the one Carol had drawn up afterward. A proper, legal, month-to-month arrangement at nominal cost, structured to give Emily legitimate occupancy of the apartment while the fraud case worked through the system, and she figured out her next step. That lease had a renewal date of February 15th. It was February 12th. She'd known the date was coming. She'd known it the way you know about a dental appointment 3 weeks out, distantly, then with increasing proximity, then suddenly all at once when you realize it's in 2 days and you still haven't decided anything. She hadn't told Landon yet. This was a deliberate choice, which she'd been pretending to herself was a practical one. She was waiting until she had a plan, waiting until she had something concrete to say rather than just the absence of a decision. But the honest version was simpler and less comfortable. She didn't know how to have the conversation, and she'd been putting it off the way you put off the conversations that will change something. The apartment search had started in January. She'd been quiet about it. She had a folder on her laptop she'd titled Spring Options with a name so deliberately neutral it was almost funny. 23 listings in various neighborhoods, filtered by the specific calculus of what she could actually afford versus what she could almost afford if she picked up tutoring sessions and stopped buying the good coffee. She'd toured 4 apartments. 2 had been fine. 1 had smelled like mildew in a way that the listing photos had worked very hard to conceal. 1 had been genuinely nice, a 1-bedroom in Inwood with good light and a landlord who seemed like a real person. And she'd stood in the empty living room and thought, this is a good apartment. And then she'd thought about the lamp on Amsterdam Avenue and the card game on the coffee table and Mia's hand in hers at the school concert. She'd taken the landlord's number. She hadn't called it. She'd been trying to be honest with herself about what that meant, with limited success. On Thursday morning, the 12th, she was at the kitchen counter grading reading assessments, 3rd grade, mid-year benchmark, the stack of papers that appeared twice a year like a minor natural disaster she'd learned to absorb, when her phone buzzed with a text from her sister. Have you told him yet? Her sister, whose name was Julia, and who called every Sunday and had been following the situation with the attentiveness of someone watching a slow-developing weather system approach a coast, had asked some version of this question every week since December. There's nothing to tell, Emily typed back. I'm figuring out my next place. That's not what I asked. Emily put the phone face down and went back to the reading assessments. Marcus had improved significantly on fluency. Priya was still rushing through comprehension questions in a way that suggested she understood the answers, but didn't trust herself to slow down enough to write them properly. She made notes in the margins with the practice shorthand she'd developed over 4 years, symbols and abbreviations that would mean nothing to anyone else but allowed her to cover 30 assessments in an evening. Her phone buzzed again. M. You know I love you. You also know you do this thing where you make the logistical decision before you figure out the actual decision. And then you spend 6 months in an apartment in Inwood being quietly miserable about a choice you made because you were scared. Emily read this twice. Then she put the phone in the kitchen drawer and closed it. She finished the assessments. Landon came that evening, Thursday, his regular day, and she'd made soup because it was February, and soup was the only honest culinary response to February in New York. He came in with Mia, who had a science project due Friday, and had apparently decided that doing it at home was less interesting than doing it at Emily's, a distinction Emily was choosing not to examine too carefully. Mia spread her project materials across the kitchen table with the territorial confidence of someone claiming land, and Landon sat across from her, and they worked, and Emily stirred soup and listened to Mia explain the water cycle in the specific tone of a child who has recently learned something and is furious that no one else has been as impressed by it as they should have been. Evaporation is actually the interesting part, Mia said, carefully cutting a cloud shape from white construction paper. Everyone thinks precipitation is the interesting part because it's the part you can see, but evaporation is invisible, and that's actually more impressive. Why more impressive, Sung? Emily asked. Because it's doing the whole thing without you even knowing. She held up the cloud. Can I use the blue marker? Second drawer. Landon was watching Mia with the look Emily had cataloged over the past 3 months. The one that was present without being performed, that was just actually there, watching his daughter exist in a room and finding it sufficient. He'd been doing that more. Mia had noticed and mentioned it approximately 0 times, which Emily suspected meant she'd noticed and was being careful with it, the way she was careful with things she didn't want to disturb. After the project was done and the soup was eaten, and Mia had declared it the best soup she'd ever had, which was generous given that it was a fairly standard minestrone, they ended up on the living room floor. Mia had found a jigsaw puzzle in the hall closet. Emily had bought it at a drugstore on a Sunday when she was restless and wanted something to do with her hands, and insisted they start it. It was 1,000 pieces. The box showed a covered bridge in Vermont in autumn, which Mia had declared boring, but she'd opened it anyway and was now sorting pieces with the systematic focus of someone who took puzzles seriously. They worked on it for an hour. The apartment was warm, the lamp was on, and outside the February city was doing its gray and cold routine. Landon sat with his back against the couch, legs stretched out, finding edge pieces with the methodical patience he applied to most things. Mia kept changing systems, first sorting by color, then by shape, then by some criterion she hadn't explained but seemed internally consistent. Emily sat cross-legged on the other side of the puzzle board and thought, 3 more days. She thought about the Inwood apartment, the good light, the reasonable landlord, the way she'd stood in the empty living room and felt the rightness of it as a practical solution and nothing else. She thought about her sister's text, which she'd been trying not to think about. At 8:45, Mia fell asleep. This happened without announcement. She'd been leaning against the couch, puzzle piece in hand, and then she was simply horizontal and breathing slow. Landon looked at her and then at Emily with the specific expression of a parent who has watched this happen many times and never quite gets over how abrupt it is. Emily got a blanket from the bedroom closet. She draped it over Mia without waking her, which was a skill she'd developed from years of reading groups and nap times. She and Landon moved to the kitchen, instinctively, the way they always did when they needed to talk without disturbing the air in the other room. She poured water. She was going to say it. She'd decided in the hallway with the blanket still in her hands. She was going to say it tonight, because the not saying was starting to cost more than the saying would. "The lease renews on Saturday," she said. She set the glass down and looked at him. He was leaning against the counter on the other side of the kitchen, arms loosely crossed. His expression shifted. She watched it move, and she understood from the speed of it that this was not new information to him. He'd known the date. Of course he'd known the date. He owned the building. "I know," he said. "I've been looking at apartments. Been a beat." "I know that too." He paused. "David mentioned you'd been asking him about the rental market in Upper Manhattan. He told me because he wasn't sure if he was supposed to be helping you or not." Emily looked at the water glass. "He could have just helped me." "I told him that." The kitchen was quiet. The refrigerator made its sound. From the living room, Mia breathed in the slow, uncomplicated rhythm of someone who had decided all the hard things were someone else's problem tonight. "I found a place," Emily said. "Inwood. It's a good apartment. The landlord seems reasonable. I can afford it without the tutoring if I'm careful, and with the tutoring comfortably." She kept her voice level. "Facts." She was good at facts. "I haven't signed anything yet, but I'm going to. I wanted to tell you first." Landon didn't say anything immediately. He looked at the counter. She watched his jaw move slightly, the tell she'd identified in October, the one that appeared when he was deciding how much to say. "Okay," he said. She'd been expecting that. It was his word, the one he used when he was accepting terms he hadn't chosen. But this time it landed differently. Flatter, like it had been dropped rather than placed. "I don't want to depend on you," she said. "I need you to understand that's what this is. I'm not leaving because I want to leave. I'm leaving because staying feels like something I haven't earned, and I don't know how to be comfortable with that." He looked up at her. "I know." "Do you?" "Yes." He said it with a directness that surprised her. "You've been paying nominal rent, which you've been supplementing with things I haven't asked you to do. You bought cleaning supplies. You fixed the bathroom faucet. You spent 2 weekends reorganizing a closet that I didn't even know needed reorganizing. You've been trying to balance the ledger in whatever way you can because owing someone something feels dangerous to you." She opened her mouth, closed it. "I pay attention," he said. Simply, not unkindly. She stopped. "That's accurate." "I know it's accurate." He uncrossed his arms and put his hands flat on the counter behind him. "I also know that what I'm about to say is going to sound like exactly the kind of thing you've spent the last 4 months trying to protect yourself against, so I'm going to ask you to just hear it out before you respond." She held very still. "Okay, I don't want you to leave." He said it straight, no preamble, no softening, The same way he'd told her the money would be returned in 48 hours. Because it's true and because you need to know it. Not because of the apartment. Not because it's convenient. Not because I've gotten used to having someone here. Because this... He stopped. Started again, and she could see him choosing, actually working for it. Because you're the first thing in 8 months that's felt real to me. Mia lights up when she knows you're here. I have actual conversations again instead of managed exchanges. I come to this apartment and I don't feel like I'm fulfilling an obligation to a dead woman anymore. I feel like I'm coming somewhere that matters. He was looking at her directly now, and she knew his face well enough to know this was costing him. I know that's a lot to put on a person. I know I'm asking you to stay in an arrangement that's lopsided in ways that are uncomfortable for you, and I know I don't have a clean solution to that. I'm just being honest. Emily was quiet for a long moment. The honest thing, and she was going to be honest because that was the only way she knew how to do this. The honest thing was that she'd been waiting for him to say it. Not exactly this, not these words, but the shape of it. The acknowledgement that there was something real here worth naming. She'd been waiting to see if he'd let it stay unspoken, because unspoken was safer, which was what most people chose. Which was what she'd assumed he would choose because it was what everyone eventually chose. He hadn't. I'm scared, she said. That was the first honest thing, so she said it first. Not of you, of the imbalance. You have everything and I have a broken laptop and a jigsaw puzzle I bought at a Dwayne Reed, and I don't know how to be in something where that disparity just lives there, where it doesn't eventually become a thing. It already lives there, he said. It's been living there since October. Has it become a thing? She thought about it, honestly. No, she admitted. Why not? Because you don't... She paused, finding the words. You don't use it. Most people do. Even good people. They don't mean to, but the weight of what they have becomes part of how they relate to people who have less. You don't do that. I had a mother who would have found that unforgivable, he said. She was specific about it. The edge of something that might have been a smile, brief and real. She'd say, Landon, money is not a personality. Do not let it become one. Emily looked at him, at the careful, incomplete person across the kitchen from her, who was bad at being wrong and had slowly, visibly gotten better at admitting it, who shut down when he was overwhelmed and had started telling her when he was overwhelmed instead, who moved through the world with a control that was partly discipline and partly armor, and who had been, in the months she'd known him, incrementally taking the armor off in ways she suspected he hadn't done with anyone in a very long time. The Inwood apartment has good light, she said. Something flickered in his face. Emily? I'm not done. She looked at the water glass, then at him. It has good light, and the landlord seems like a reasonable person, and I can afford it. And I should want those things to be enough. She paused. They're not enough. And I've been trying to make them be enough for 3 weeks, and they're not. She exhaled. That's the honest version. He was watching her with an expression she didn't quite have a name for. Cautious, careful, something underneath that wasn't either of those things. So what do you want? He asked. The question was so direct it almost made her laugh. I want to stop having the version of this conversation where nobody says what they actually mean, she said. I want Saturday's lease renewal to not be the last one. I want to stop pretending I'm in a temporary situation when it stopped feeling temporary in November. She stopped herself, breathed. I want things to stay like this, however this is. And I'm terrified of saying that because I don't know what this is, and I don't want to name it wrong. The kitchen was very quiet. You can name it whatever you want, Landon said. You can name it slowly. We cannot name it at all for a while. He paused. But I don't want you to go to Inwood. She looked at him across the kitchen, the tile counter between them, the small geography of the space she'd been living in for 4 months, the kitchen where she'd been making tea when he walked in and where they'd had every conversation that mattered since. Okay, she said. He heard her use his word, and something in his face moved. Not a smile, exactly. Something more interior than a smile. Something that landed in his eyes and stayed. Okay, he said back. They stood there for a moment, not moving, because sometimes the right thing is to let a moment be what it is before you start moving through it. Then Mia made a sound from the living room, a small, half-asleep murmur of someone shifting position. And they both turned automatically toward the sound, and then looked at each other, and that was the moment Emily felt it most clearly. The naturalness of turning in the same direction at the same sound. The unthinking coordination of it. Landon went to check on Mia. Emily turned and put the water glasses in the sink and ran the tap and thought about what had just happened with the quiet attention of someone cataloging something they want to remember exactly. He came back to the kitchen doorway. She's fine, just turning over. He leaned against the frame. I should get her home. I know. I'll call Carol tomorrow about the lease renewal. I'll call the Inwood landlord. He nodded. He didn't move from the doorway immediately. That pause again. The real one. The one that wasn't composed. She'd come to understand these pauses as the moments when he was closest to saying the thing he was actually thinking, as opposed to the version of it he'd already edited. Thank you, he said, for not making me say all of that to an empty room. Thank you for saying it anyway. She looked at him. That wasn't easy. No. A beat. It really wasn't. She almost said something else. Decided the night had carried enough already. Good night, Landon. Good night. He woke Mia gently. She came back to consciousness with the practical acceptance of a child who understood that adults had bedtimes too, and helped her into her coat, and at the door Mia, still half asleep, turned to Emily and said, You're not leaving, right? Emily blinked. What? Dad gets quiet when he's worried about something. Mia looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to be subtle about the things she needed. He was being quiet about you, so you're not leaving? Emily looked at Landon, who looked like he was deciding whether to be embarrassed or grateful, and had landed somewhere in between. I'm not leaving, Emily said. Mia nodded, apparently satisfied, and walked out into the hallway. Landon followed and at the last second turned back with an expression that was, for him, remarkably unguarded. She closed the door. Stood in the quiet apartment. She texted her sister. Not going to Inwood. Julia's response came in 40 seconds. Finally. Also, I want details. Call me Sunday. Emily put the phone on the counter and went back to the living room, where the jigsaw puzzle was still spread across the floor. The covered bridge in Vermont still mostly incomplete, edge pieces separated, the middle a beautiful, patient mess. She sat down and found a piece. She worked on it alone for an hour, and she was happy, which was a simple thing, and she let it be simple. The spring arrived slowly, the way it always did in New York. Not all at once, but in pieces. A warm day followed by 2 cold ones. Crocuses appearing in Central Park while the wind was still February sharp. The light changing in a way that was almost imperceptible, until suddenly one evening you looked out the window and understood it was different, that something had shifted while you weren't paying attention. Emily noticed the shift the way she noticed most things, in specifics rather than in general. The morning in March when she walked to school and didn't need the heavy coat. The first day she opened the window in the kitchen and left it open while she made coffee. The afternoon Mia showed up after school with mud on her shoes and the specific energy of a child who'd spent recess outside in real warmth for the first time in months. Things between her and Landon had not dramatically changed after February's kitchen conversation. This was something she'd needed to make peace with and she understood that he moved at the pace he moved at, that the conversation had been significant without being a resolution, that the territory between I don't want you to leave and everything that came after it was real territory that had to be actually covered. They were covering it. In March, he invited her to a foundation working lunch that was ostensibly about the spring grant cycle and turned out to also involve her sitting across from 4 board members who all clearly knew who she was, which told her that Landon had, at some point, mentioned her in contexts she hadn't been present for. She found she didn't mind. She sat at the table and talked about arts education in underfunded schools with the specific, grounded knowledge of someone who had been in those schools for 4 years. And afterward, Patricia Huang found her in the hallway and said, without preamble, "You should be on the board." Emily had laughed. "I'm not joking," Patricia said. I know you're not, but I'm a 3rd-grade teacher." His mother was a 3rd-grade teacher. Patricia looked at her with the particular patience of someone who was used to saying things to people who weren't ready to hear them yet. Think about it. She thought about it. She hadn't said yes. She also hadn't said no, which was its own kind of answer. In April, Mia started coming to the apartment after school, on days when her father was still in meetings, and the nanny had scheduling conflicts, a practical arrangement, Landon said, that required Emily's agreement, and which Emily gave without hesitation. Mia did homework at the kitchen table, ate snacks with the focus of someone conducting important fuel research, and talked about school in the stream of consciousness way she'd adopted with Emily that her father said she didn't use with anyone else. "It's because you don't react weird," Mia said once, without looking up from her math worksheet. "React weird how? Like you're going to fix something, or like you feel bad." She chewed her pencil eraser in a way Emily had told her twice was bad for her teeth and would probably tell her again. "You just listen like it's interesting." "It is interesting." Mia looked up then, briefly, with an expression that was so like her father's. That particular kind of surprised that comes from having what you said taken seriously when you weren't expecting it, that Emily felt the similarity in her chest. "Yeah," Mia said, and went back to her worksheet. One evening in late April, Landon arrived to pick up Mia and found them on the living room floor again. Not the jigsaw puzzle this time, which had been finished in March and now lived completed on the coffee table under a piece of glass Emily had found at the hardware store. This time it was Mia's history project, which involved constructing a timeline of New York City on a piece of poster board approximately the length of Emily's arm, covered in Mia's handwriting and what she called artistic elements, and Emily called evidence of a child who should probably consider art school. He stood in the doorway from the entryway. Neither of them had heard him come in. He had a key now, a proper one, given without ceremony in March. Emily looked up. He looked at the two of them on the floor with the poster board between them, and something happened in his face that he didn't try to contain the way he used to. He just let it be there. Whatever it was, private and real, the thing that belonged to him and nobody was asking him to share. "How's 1850?" he said. "Complicated," Mia said. "The infrastructure was really bad. Emily says that's still a theme." Emily's not wrong. He came and sat on the couch behind them, close enough to see the timeline, and Mia angled the poster board so he could see it better. And for a while he just sat there while she explained the decisions she'd made, and Emily added context when Mia looked at her. And the apartment held all three of them, the way it had been doing for months. Without drama, without announcement, as if it had simply decided this was what it was for. Later, after Mia had been put to bed in the guest room, she sometimes fell asleep here now, took a car home in the morning. Landon and Emily sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of dinner between them and the particular quiet that came after a long day that had been mostly good. "She wants to stay here more," he said. He was looking at his coffee. "She asked me last week if she could have a key." Emily looked at the table. "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it." A pause. "I've been thinking about it." She looked up at him. He was watching her with the direct, undefended quality he'd had more of since February, like he'd made a decision somewhere to stop curating what he let show. "This is her home too," Emily said carefully. "Whatever else this is, she's part of this place. She should have a key." "Whatever else this is," he repeated softly. She met his eyes. "I'm not trying to avoid it. I know?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think I've been waiting to be sure enough to say it right, and I'm starting to understand that might not be how it works. Being sure enough." He turned his coffee mug, the habit, the tell. "I'm not sure of anything. I'm sure I don't want to be anywhere I'm not when I'm here. I'm sure Mia has been more herself in this apartment than she's been anywhere since my mother died. I'm sure that when you talk about leaving, even theoretically, even in a hypothetical, something shifts in a way I don't like." He looked at her steadily. "That's what I have. I know it's not a complete—" "It's enough," she said. He stopped. "It's enough," she said again, quieter. "I don't need complete. I've never had complete. I've had careful and honest and showing up when it's hard." She looked at her own hands on the table. "You've done all of those." The kitchen was very still. He reached across the table. Not far. The table wasn't wide. He put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over, and that was all. Nothing dramatic, nothing resolved in the way of movies and clean endings. Just his hand in hers in the kitchen where they'd first sat strangers over tea and sandwiches, in February, in a city that didn't stop for anything. She wasn't sure how long they sat like that. Long enough for the coffee to go fully cold. long enough for the city sounds to shift into their late evening register, long enough for the thing that had been building quietly for months to settle into its own shape. Not a beginning and not an ending, but a middle, which was the hardest part and also the realest. "Mia's going to be insufferable," Emily said eventually. "She's going to say she knew," Landon said. "She's going to say this exact thing. I knew it the first time I saw you. She'll mean it as a compliment and a declaration of victory simultaneously." Emily laughed, the real one, the helpless kind. "You're absolutely right. She gets it from her grandmother." He said it without the weight it used to carry. Not light exactly, but different. Something that had been put down and picked back up and was being carried more easily now. "My mother would have known too, first 5 minutes." Emily thought about a woman who grew up looking at this building from the outside, who taught elementary school and had a son who bought her dream and couldn't go back to it until a stranger was already in the kitchen. "She'd have made you knock," Emily said. Landon looked at her. "On the door. She'd have made you knock instead of just walking in with your key." Emily tilted her head. "She sounds like someone who believed in doing things properly." He was quiet for a second. Then, quietly, with the kind of smile that arrived without permission and didn't apologize for itself. "Yeah, she did." They stayed at the table a while longer. Outside, April moved through the city the way it always did. Tentative and then not, cold one moment and warm the next, working out what it wanted to be. 41 floors up, the lamp was on in the living room. The covered bridge puzzle sat complete under its glass. The card game was in the drawer now, retired between visits, waiting. The kitchen was warm, the coffee was cold. Neither of them moved to do anything about either of these things. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was, without either of them saying so, a beginning that had been happening for a long time already. May came in warm and slightly humid, the kind of weather that made the city smell like itself again. Asphalt and coffee, and something indefinably alive, the smell of 10 million people going about their business in close proximity and making it work through sheer collective stubbornness. Emily had always loved May in New York. It was the month that made you forget February had ever happened. The hearing for Gerald Holt's case was scheduled for the 14th. She'd known the date for 6 weeks. Carol had sent the notification with her usual clean efficiency, along with a 3-paragraph summary of what to expect and a gentle note that Emily's presence was requested but not strictly required, that her documentation alone was sufficient if she preferred not to attend. Emily had read the email twice, typed a response saying she'd be there, deleted it, typed it again, and sent it before she could change her mind. She told Landon over dinner the night before. Not that she was going, he already knew that, had known since Carol sent the notification, but what she was feeling about it, which was the harder thing to say. "I'm not angry at him," she said. She'd been surprised by this, had spent several weeks waiting for the anger to arrive and finding mostly just a tired kind of frustration. "I keep expecting to be angry and I feel sorry for him," which is probably naive. Landon was quiet for a moment. He had the look he got when he was deciding between the easy response and the true one. He almost always landed on the true one now, which she'd noticed and appreciated and never mentioned because mentioning it would have made him self-conscious about it. "It's not naive," he said. "He's a desperate man who did a stupid, harmful thing. Understanding why someone does something doesn't excuse it, but it's not naive either." He paused. "My mother used to say the opposite of compassion isn't anger, it's indifference. And you're not indifferent." Emily turned her fork in the pasta. She sounds like she said a lot of things that stuck. She talked constantly. He said it with the particular affection of someone who had spent a long time missing a specific voice. "I used to find it exhausting. Now I can't remember half of it precisely, which is..." He stopped, set down his own fork. "I'm losing the exact words, the exact way she said things. I can remember the meaning, but not the sound." Emily looked at him. This was the most directly she'd heard him say it. The specific fear of forgetting that lived inside grief and didn't go away, even when the grief itself softened. "Tell me one," she said. "The ones you do remember. Tell me exactly." He looked at her. "What?" "Say one exactly, the way she said it, word for word." A long pause. He looked at the table. "She used to say, when I was a kid and I'd gotten something wrong, made a mistake in school or whatever, she'd say, 'Landon, what did you learn? Good. Now put it in your pocket and don't lose it.' His voice was careful, precise, handling the words like they were fragile. She said it so many times I can still hear the exact inflection. Emily held that. That's a good one. Yeah. He looked up. Something in his face had eased slightly. The specific relief of having something stay intact when you weren't sure it would. She was good at those. Tell Mia, Emily said. The ones you remember exactly. Tell her now, while they're still clear. He was quiet for a moment. Then, she might already know some of them. She'd want to know all of them. He nodded, slow and real, like something had been handed to him that he was going to take care of. The hearing the next morning was in a courtroom that was smaller than Emily had imagined, and significantly less dramatic than television had led her to believe courtrooms would be. Fluorescent lighting, institutional chairs, the smell of old paper and recycled air. She sat in the gallery section with Carol beside her and watched Gerald Holt walk in. He was smaller than she'd expected. She'd built him into something in her mind over the past 6 months, a shape that represented betrayal and violation and the specific cruelty of someone targeting people who couldn't easily absorb the loss. The person who walked in was a man in his mid-50s with a rumpled suit and the posture of someone who had been carrying shame for long enough that it had become structural. He didn't look at this gallery. He looked at the table, then at his attorney, then at the judge when the judge arrived. The proceedings were efficient, which Carol had told her to expect. Gerald's attorney had, in fact, reached the plea arrangement that Carol had mentioned months ago. Gerald would plead guilty to wire fraud and identity theft, accept a suspended sentence contingent on full restitution to all 4 victims and 200 hours of community service, and avoid prison time. It wasn't a harsh outcome. Emily had thought she'd feel something about that it wasn't harsh enough, that he should have faced more. But sitting in the fluorescent-lit room watching a small, shame-worn man confirm his guilty plea, she found she mostly felt the same tired exhaustion she'd been carrying since October. The restitution amount was confirmed, $4,200, to be transferred within 60 days. Carol leaned over and said quietly, "You can direct it toward the repayment you've been making to the Building Operations Fund. I've drafted the paperwork." Emily nodded. She'd been making regular payments, small ones, fitted to her budget, with the precise consistency of someone who needed this particular thing to be true about themselves. Landon had never once mentioned it. Carol had been handling it the way Carol handled most things, efficiently and without judgment. When it was over, she stood outside the courthouse in the May morning, and she thought about 8 months ago. A woman with a suitcase and a fraudulent lease and $4,200 she'd saved for 8 months, standing in an apartment that wasn't hers. She thought about the particular loneliness of that version of herself, the careful, self-sufficient loneliness she'd been carrying for so long she'd stopped knowing it was heavy. She took out her phone and called Landon. He picked up on the second ring. "How did it go?" "It's done," she said. "Guilty plea. Restitution confirmed." A pause. "Are you okay?" She looked at the courthouse steps, the May sky above the building, a pigeon doing something optimistic near the curb. "Yeah," she said. "I actually am. Where are you?" "Outside the courthouse." "Stay there. I'll send the car." "Landon, I can take the subway." "I know you can. Stay there." She stayed there. The car arrived in 11 minutes. She got in and looked out the window at the city moving past and felt, for the first time since October, the specific lightness of a weight she'd grown so accustomed to that she'd forgotten she was carrying it. It was over. The actual, concrete, legal proceeding part of it was over. Everything that had grown up around it was still going. But the thing that had started it, the violation of it, the Gerald Holt part, was finished. She could put it in her pocket, move on. The school year ended on a Thursday in June that was too hot for June, the kind of heat that arrived early and made everyone slightly irritable in the specific way of people who feel personally betrayed by weather. Emily's classroom had one air conditioning unit that was either working or not working depending on the hour, and by 11 a.m. it had chosen not to work, and 33rd graders had staged a collective morale collapse that she'd spent the rest of the morning managing with paper fans and the kind of determined cheerfulness that teachers develop as a professional survival mechanism. At 2 o'clock they had the end-of-year party, which involved cupcakes from the bakery 3 blocks away and the reading of a classmate book. a tradition Emily had started her second year, where each student wrote and illustrated one page about something they'd learned. The pages were assembled in spiral bound, and Emily kept one copy, and each family got one, and it was the thing she was most proud of professionally, not because it was impressive, but because it was real. The pages were honest. Third graders had not yet learned to perform learning for an audience. This year's contributions ranged from, I learned that volcanoes can go to sleep for a really long time, and then wake up, which is creepy. Marcus, who had leaned hard into earth science all year, to, I learned that my brain has different parts that do different jobs and they talk to each other without me knowing. Priya, who had taken one lesson on neuroscience and run with it for 3 months. 2, I learned that when something is hard, it doesn't mean you're bad at it, it means you're learning it. This from a boy named Sam who had struggled with reading since September and was, by June, genuinely reading, which was the quiet miracle that reminded Emily every year why she did this. She read them aloud. All of them. Even the ones that wandered off their own point. She read them the way they deserved to be read, which was as if they mattered, because they did. By the time the last cupcake was eaten and the last parent had picked up the last child in the classroom was the specific aftermath of a party. Crumpled napkins, cupcake wrappers, the desk slightly askew from all the moving around. Emily sat on her desk and looked at the empty room and felt the usual mix of exhaustion and something that wasn't quite pride but was adjacent to it. The particular satisfaction of a year completed, of 30 children who were, each in their own way, slightly more themselves than they'd been in September. She took a photo of the classroom. She texted it to Julia, who responded with a string of emojis that communicated deep sisterly approval. Then she texted it to Landon, because he was the other person she wanted to tell things to, which was still a relatively new realization and still caught her slightly off guard when she noticed it. He replied, "Last day? Last day. The cupcakes were acceptable, high praise, for third grade. For adults, they were fine. 3 dots. Then, come home when you're done. Mia has a plan." Emily stared at the word home in the text message. He'd used it before, casually, in passing, the way words slipped into usage without announcement. She'd noticed every time and said nothing and let it settle into the ordinary, which it had. She packed her bag, turned off the lights, walked out of the classroom and down the hallway and out of the building into the too hot June afternoon. She took the subway uptown. She went home. The plan, it turned out, was a rooftop dinner. Not the building's roof. The penthouse had its own terrace, accessible through a glass door off the living room that Emily had only used twice, both times briefly, because it had felt like an indulgence she hadn't fully granted herself. Mia had apparently decided that the last day of school required celebration and had spent the afternoon, under intermittent supervision from the nanny and then Landon, setting up the terrace with a level of ambition that had outpaced her execution in some areas and exceeded expectations in others. The table was legitimately well set. Mia had a strong aesthetic sense and had chosen well from the options available. The lighting was a strand of small bulbs that she'd found in a closet and attached to the terrace railing with what appeared to be an excessive amount of tape. The flowers were from the bodega on the corner, assembled in a water glass because a vase hadn't been located, which was not a bad solution. The menu, written in Mia's handwriting on a folded piece of notebook paper and presented to Emily at the door with formal seriousness, listed pasta, not giving up, ambitious, bread, salad, the kind without weird things in it, and dessert, surprise. Emily looked at the menu, looked at Mia, who was watching her with the focused attention of someone awaiting a verdict. "This is very good," Emily said. Mia exhaled. "I wasn't sure about the flowers. The flowers are perfect. I didn't know if the glass was okay instead of a vase. It's better than a vase. Vases are formal. This is dinner." Mia turned to Landon with the expression of someone who had been vindicated. "I told you the glass was fine." "You did," he agreed. He caught Emily's eye over Mia's head. Something warm and quiet moved between them, in the way things moved between people who had accumulated enough of a shared language that a look carried sentences. They had dinner on the terrace in the June evening, the 3 of them, with the city spread out below like something someone had designed specifically for this moment, which it hadn't been, which was part of why it worked. The light went from gold to orange to the deep blue that came before dark, and the small bulbs clicked on automatically with the dimming light. And Mia talked about school ending and summer plans and a book she'd started, and a friend who was going to camp, and whether Emily thought dogs were better than cats, which had been an ongoing research project for several months. "I think they're different goods," Emily said. "Dogs are good in one way. Cats are good in another." "That's a dodge," Mia said. "That's a nuanced position." "Dad always says that when he doesn't want to answer something." Emily looked at Landon. "She's right," she told him. "That is what you do." "I'm being misrepresented," he said, and ate his pasta. The surprise dessert turned out to be a store-bought chocolate cake with the words "School is over" finally written in red frosting that Mia had applied herself with the results that were enthusiastic if not precise. Emily laughed when she saw it, the real laugh, the one she couldn't always control. And Mia took this as the highest possible compliment. They ate cake in the blue dark with the city lights below. Mia fell asleep in the terrace chair at some point, a piece of cake still on her plate. Her head tilted at an angle that would have been uncomfortable if she'd been awake. Landon covered her with the blanket Emily had quietly retrieved from inside without either of them saying anything about it. They'd done this before, the wordless coordination of two people who had learned each other's responses. He sat back down. The city was fully dark now below them, all light and movement, the indifferent, beautiful machinery of it running the way it always did. "She worked on this for 3 hours," he said quietly. "The table setting alone took 45 minutes. She made me look up how to fold napkins. She did a good job. She wanted it to be right for you." He looked at the sleeping Mia, then at Emily. "She doesn't do that for most people. Work that hard to get something right for them." Emily looked at Mia in the blanket, the small, determined face at rest, the paint-stained jacket she'd been wearing since December still her favorite, the slightly crooked braid she'd done herself that morning and refused assistance with. She thought about a 9-year-old who had lost her grandmother and had never really had her mother and had found, in a strange rearrangement of circumstances that started with a fraud and a rainy night and a stranger in a kitchen, something she had apparently decided was worth working 3 hours on a table for. "I know," Emily said softly. "She's going to need you," Landon said. Not manipulatively. He said it the way he said real things, directly, without dressing them up. Not just now, as she gets older. She's going to need someone who listens without trying to fix her. You do that. He paused. I don't always do that. I'm working on it. You're better than you think you are. You're more patient than I deserve. Probably. She looked at him. We've established we're both bad at this. We're doing okay. He looked at the city, at the lit square of the kitchen window visible through the terrace door, the lamp on in the living room, the apartment that had been empty for 7 months and wasn't empty anymore. I want to show you something, he said. Tomorrow, if you're free. There's somewhere I haven't been in 8 months, and I think I'm ready to go, and I want you to come with me. She looked at him. My mother's house, he said. The house she lived in when she was alive, in Queens. I've had the estate manager handling the property decisions. I haven't gone back. He was turned toward the city, his profile against the dark. I think I'm supposed to go back. I think I've been supposed to for a while, and I've been waiting until I could do it without... He paused. Without falling apart. And now, I don't know if I won't fall apart. He looked at her. But I don't want to go alone. Emily held his gaze. She thought about a woman in her 60s standing outside a building as a girl, imagining what it would be like to live somewhere like that. She thought about a son who bought the building and couldn't go back. She thought about the specific, human, ordinary courage it took to ask someone to witness your grief rather than perform recovery for them. Tomorrow, she said. Whatever time you want. Something in him settled. Not dramatically, just the small, real easing of someone who has been carrying something alone and has been offered help and has accepted it. Thank you, he said. Stop thanking me. It's sincere. I know, that's why you should stop. I'm not doing you a favor. She looked at the sleeping Mia, at the chocolate cake, at the string of lights taped with excessive tape to the terrace railing. This is just what we do now. He was quiet for a moment, then quietly. Yeah, it is. The house in Queens was a 2-story colonial on a street of similar houses, modest by the standards of what Landon could have provided, which was something that had clearly been a choice his mother made and kept making for her entire life. The yard had a garden that the estate manager had been maintaining, though you could tell it had been maintained by someone following instructions rather than someone who knew what they were doing. The roses were alive, but not thriving. The perennials were in the right places, but slightly too crowded together. She'd had opinions about gardening. Emily could see that immediately. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment before going in. Landon had the key in his hand and was looking at the front door the way he'd looked at the Penthouse door in October, with the specific stillness of someone gathering themselves for a thing they'd decided to do. Emily didn't say anything. She stood beside him and let him take the moment he needed. He unlocked the door. The house smelled like a house that had been closed for a while, that particular still, preserved quality. But underneath it was still her. Old books and something faintly floral, a smell that was clearly specific to this person and this place and wasn't replicated anywhere else. Emily felt Landon register at the moment they stepped inside, saw the breath he took and held. She walked beside him through the rooms. He talked slowly, in pieces. The kitchen where she'd made his lunches until he was 16 and had rebelled against packed lunches on general principle, and she'd let him stop and then started sending him with money, and then found out he was spending the money on things that were not lunch and had, without anger but with clarity, explained that this was not what the money was for. The living room where she'd watch the news every evening like it was her civic duty. The shelf in the hallway where she kept photographs going back to her own childhood, mixed in with all of his, not arranged chronologically, not arranged by anything in particular, just accumulated, the way a life accumulates. Emily looked at the photographs. School pictures, graduations, holidays. A young woman she recognized as Landon's mother, in her 20s. A wide smile, the kind that had clearly been passed to her son and that he deployed about as often as a solar eclipse. Mia as a toddler, round-faced and serious. Landon, at maybe 14, caught off guard by the camera, looking slightly irritated by its existence. "You had the same look," Emily said. He looked at the photo. "What look?" "The one you have when someone catches you off guard, like you've been trespassed upon." He looked at her. "It's not bad," she said. "It's very specific to you. I just recognized it." She looked back at the photos. She kept everything. She threw nothing away that mattered. He was standing beside her, close, both of them looking at the shelf. "I used to tease her about it. Said she was a curator of things that didn't need curating." He paused. She said, "Landon, you'll thank me later. Memories don't keep themselves." Emily smiled. "Put that one in your pocket." He looked at her. The particular look, the one she still didn't have a name for, the one that was his version of something she suspected was the same thing she felt when she looked at him. "Yeah," he said softly. "Already did." They were in the house for 2 hours. Not all of it was easy. There was a moment in the upstairs hallway when he stopped at the door to her bedroom and stood there for long enough that Emily just stood beside him and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Not everything needed navigating. Some things just needed to be stood in for a while. "Oh, he cried briefly, in the way that people cried who didn't do it often, not dramatically, just a few seconds of it, turned slightly away from her with his hand over his mouth. She put her hand on his back. That was all. He didn't need more than that, and she didn't offer more than that. And after a moment, he took a breath and straightened, and they kept walking. They ended up in the kitchen, which was where they always ended up. He made coffee. He found the old machine without looking for it, found the coffee in the same cabinet it had always been in, did it all the way you do things when you know a place in your body before your brain catches up. They sat at the kitchen table in his mother's house in Queens and drank coffee in the afternoon light. "She'd have called this dramatic," he said. "Me avoiding the house for 8 months? She'd have called it dramatic and unnecessary." "Probably," Emily said. "She also would have understood it." "She understood most things." He turned the mug. "She'd have liked you specifically." Patricia said the same thing. "Patricia's been saying things about you to me, too. She thinks you should be on the board." Emily looked at her coffee. "She mentioned it." "You should. I'm a third-grade teacher." "Who knows more about arts education in underfunded schools than anyone in that room, because you've actually been there?" He looked at her directly. "You have things to say that people in those rooms need to hear." My mother understood that too. She spent years in those rooms, and she always said the people with the least power in the education system had the most knowledge of it. Emily sat with that. Not the flattery of it, but the substance of it. The question of what she was going to do with what she knew. She'd been asking herself that in various forms for 4 years. She'd always answered with, keep teaching because the classroom was where it happened, where it was real. where 30 small people were actually affected. That was still true. It would always be true. But there were other rooms. And maybe she'd been in the habit of assuming those rooms weren't for her, when the habit was the only reason they weren't. "I'll think about it," she said. "That's different from no." "I know." He nodded, accepted it, moved on without pressing, the way he'd learned to do with things she needed time on. Before they left, he walked to the garden in the backyard and stood looking at it for a minute. Emily stood at the back door and watched him look at the roses his mother had planted and not quite thrived with the maintenance they'd been given. "She had specific opinions about the roses," he said, without turning around. "I can see that. She'd know exactly what's wrong with them." "Do you?" A pause. "No." He looked at them. "I don't know anything about roses." "I know a little," Emily said. "My grandmother grew them. The crowding is the main problem. They need more air between them, and they want more water than they're getting." He turned, looked at her. "You know about roses?" "A little," she shrugged. "My grandmother had a garden. I used to help." She looked at the roses. "They're not dead. They just need attention." He was quiet for a long moment, looking at the garden, at the house, at something she couldn't see but could feel him settling around. "I'm going to keep the house," he said. It didn't sound like a decision being made in this moment. It sounded like a decision that had been made somewhere deeper and was only now being said out loud. Not sell it. Not manage it from a distance. Keep it and actually be in it sometimes. He paused. Mia should know this place. It was her grandmother's. She should know where it is. Emily nodded. Yes, she should. He looked at the roses one more time. Maybe someone who knows about roses could come back sometime and tell me what to do about them. She looked at him, at the almost not quite smile, at the man who had walked into a dark apartment 8 months ago and found a stranger in his kitchen and had, instead of calling the police, stayed to talk, which was the most unguarded thing she suspected he'd ever done in his adult life, and which had changed in the quiet, unglamorous way that real things changed, everything that came after. "I think that could be arranged," she said. They drove back to Manhattan in the late afternoon, the city building up around them as they crossed the bridge. Mia had texted 3 times during the visit, once to ask what they were doing, once to ask when they'd be back, and once to send a photo of a dog she'd seen on the street with the caption "evidence" and no other context, which they both understood to be part of her ongoing campaign. In the car, Emily answered the dog text. "The evidence is compelling." Mia replied immediately. "I know." Landon read over her shoulder and said nothing, but the side of his mouth moved. That evening, the 3 of them made dinner in the Penthouse kitchen. An actual production, Mia having decided that their respective days warranted something better than pasta, so they were making her grandmother's recipe for roast chicken. Landon had found it written on an index card in his mother's handwriting, tucked into a cookbook he'd brought back from the Queen's house, and had photographed it and sent it to Emily on the drive home without any explanation. And she'd understood what it meant without needing one, so they made the chicken. Mia read instructions from the index card with the gravity of an official document. Landon followed them with more precision than the recipe probably required. Emily managed the vegetables and the temperature and the timing, and explained what she was doing when Mia asked, which Mia then explained to her father in more elaborate terms than were strictly necessary. The kitchen was warm and loud and slightly chaotic in the way of any kitchen where multiple people were cooking and one of them was 9 and conducting organizational operations that weren't always aligned with what was actually needed. A dish towel fell on the floor. The smoke detector went off briefly when the oven was opened wrong. Mia declared the vegetables cut unevenly, which was true, and spent 4 minutes correcting this with a focus usually reserved for the puzzle. It was imperfect and real and entirely fine. When the chicken was done and they sat at the table and Mia announced that it tasted exactly like she remembered from when she was little. Exactly. The same, she was sure of it. Landon went very still for just a moment. Just a beat. Then he reached over and tucked a loose strand of Mia's hair back from her face and said, "Yeah, it does." Emily looked at her plate. She felt the weight of the moment the way you felt the weight of good things. Not comfortable exactly, more like full. Like something had been filled that she hadn't known was empty. After dinner, while Mia was washing up with the conscientious thoroughness she applied to tasks she'd decided to care about, Landon stood beside Emily at the kitchen window. The city was doing its evening thing below. Lights coming on, the specific movement of the crosstown hour, a siren somewhere that faded before it became anything. 8 months ago, he said, I walked in here and heard someone humming. She looked at him. I almost didn't come in, he said. I was standing in the hallway, and the logical thing was to call the police. I was reaching for my phone. What stopped you? He was quiet for a moment, looking at the city. I don't know exactly. The sound. He paused. It sounded like someone who was at home here. And I'd never been at home here. I was curious what that looked like. Emily thought about herself on that night, a 30-year-old woman who had saved for 8 months and been defrauded and was making tea in an apartment she thought was hers, humming something she couldn't even remember now, completely unaware that everything was about to change. She thought about all the things that had needed to go wrong for this to go right. 41, she said. Your mother said it was a number that didn't give up. He turned to look at her. You told me that first night. She looked at the window at the city. I think about it sometimes. He was quiet for a moment. She said it about the floor number, because 40 felt like enough and 41 kept going anyway. I know. Emily looked at him. That's why I think about it. He held her gaze, and then, without the pause this time, without the gathering himself or the editing or the careful approach, he leaned forward and kissed her, simple and real and unhurried, the way things were when they'd been building for a long time and had finally arrived somewhere. She kissed him back. From the sink, Mia said, finally, completely deadpan, without turning around, the sound of dishes continuing. They broke apart. Emily pressed her hand over her mouth. Landon looked at the ceiling. I told you I knew since the first time I saw you, Mia said, still not turning around. I told Dad. He said I was being presumptuous. I said I was being observant. I was right. You were right, Landon said with the tone of a man who had accepted certain inevitabilities. I know. She put a dish on the rack. Can we get a dog now? The question landed in the kitchen and sat there, and Emily laughed, the helpless, real kind. And Landon looked at his daughter's back, and then at Emily. And what moved through him in that moment wasn't something he would have had words for even if he'd tried, which he didn't. The city ran on below them. The lamp was on in the living room. The jigsaw puzzle, complete under glass, sat on the coffee table. The card game was in the drawer. The index card with the roast chicken recipe was propped against the backsplash where someone had put it during dinner and nobody had moved it yet, the handwriting on it small and specific and preserved. This was the thing about homes, real ones, the kind that weren't built by money or square footage or correct furniture arrangements. They were built by accumulated evenings, by card games with invented rules, by soup in February and rooftop dinners in June, by the patience of sitting with someone in a room that hurt and not trying to fix the hurt, by saying the true thing even when the easy thing was available, by a 9-year-old who set a table for 3 hours because she wanted it to be right for someone she'd chosen, the way children chose things, completely, without strategy, with the whole uncalculated weight of what they had. Emily had arrived at this apartment with a suitcase and a fraudulent lease, and the particular self-sufficiency of someone who had learned to need very little because needing things had, in her experience, been a reliable path to disappointment. She'd spent years making herself smaller to fit available spaces, saving money for 8 months to afford a single step up, learning to name everything she did a choice because choice felt better than circumstance. She'd been alone for a very long time. She'd convinced herself she was good at it. She hadn't been wrong, exactly. She was good at being alone. She was also, it turned out, better at this. There was no lesson she could have arrived at intellectually that would have done what the past 8 months had done. Taught her, through the unavoidable education of actual experience, that accepting help was not the same as losing ground, that being known was not the same as being exposed, that a home was not a space you deserved or earned or were granted. It was a thing you made with whoever showed up and stayed. Gerald Holt had tried to take something from her. He'd taken money and security and peace of mind and several months of sleep. He hadn't gotten what he thought he was taking because what he thought he was taking was the apartment. What she'd lost and found again in the same 8 months was harder to put on a legal document. It didn't have a dollar amount. It wasn't in any folder on any laptop. She was still learning what to call it, The word she kept arriving at was simple, and she kept deciding it was too small for what she meant, and then deciding that maybe the small words were the ones that had lasted for a reason. Home. Family. Enough. Mia turned from the sink, drying her hands on the dish towel, and looked at the two of them with the bright satisfaction of someone whose plan had arrived exactly where she'd intended it. "So," she said. "The dog." Landon looked at Emily. Emily looked at Landon. The kitchen held all three of them. The warm and imperfect and entirely sufficient kitchen on the 41st floor, the one that had started as an obligation and a memory and a strange woman with a fraudulent lease and a humming voice. "We'll talk about it," Landon said. Mia recognized correctly that this was different from no. She smiled, wide, unguarded, the smile that looked like her father's must have looked before he learned to be careful with it. Outside, the city kept going. It always did. Inside, for three people who had needed each other before they knew it, the evening settled into itself. It was enough. It was exactly enough. It was everything the kitchen had ever held.